If you were a child in Tudor England, your future wasn't shaped by personality tests, inspirational teachers, or a heartfelt desire to follow your passion. Instead, it was shaped by a piece of parchment, a quill pen, and parents who decided your career path before you had a chance to learn how terrible you would eventually be at it. A Tudor apprenticeship wasn't a job. It was a legally binding transformation of your existence. Imagine being 8 or 9 years old and discovering that your next 7 to 10 years had already been mapped out, like a grim medieval syllabus where every class was titled Obedience, Labour, or Please Don't Annoy the Master Today. Hello travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. To understand how enormous this decision was, you have to imagine the Tudor world view. Childhood, as we understand it, didn't really exist. Children weren't seen as adorable mini-humans with potential. They were seen as inexperienced adults who needed to be moulded, corrected, and organised before they had the chance to cause trouble. Apprenticeship was the Tudor solution to this, a system that removed children from the unpredictability of their own homes and placed them under the guidance, a polite word for control, of a master craftsman who would train them, discipline them, feed them just enough to keep them functional, and ensure they emerged on the other side as a person capable of contributing something useful to society. But to get to that point, someone had to sign the dreaded indenture contract. And here's the fun part. Children didn't get a say. The agreement was between the master and the parents, with the child standing beside them like an anxious piece of luggage. The parchment spelled out everything, including how long the apprenticeship would last, the rules the apprentice had to follow, and all the things they weren't allowed to do. The list of restrictions often looked longer than the list of training benefits. A typical indenture basically assumed the apprentice was a dangerous creature who needed to be kept away from dice, women, ale, late nights, gambling, marriage, running away, or making eye contact with the wrong person. Meanwhile, the master promised only 2 things: to teach the trade and not to kill the child on purpose. A fair bargain, apparently. The contract mattered because it shifted legal responsibility. Once signed, the apprentice belonged to the master's household, not symbolically, but structurally. The master became responsible for the apprentice's moral behaviour, work ethic, church attendance, and overall survival. In return, the apprentice owed absolute obedience. This wasn't a student-teacher relationship. This was the medieval equivalent of joining a 7-year boot camp where the drill sergeant also controlled your bed, your food, your clothes, and your future prospects. You weren't just learning a skill, you were being shaped into a person who could function in society obsessed with order and stability. What made this even more dramatic was that indentures had the force of law. Breaking them wasn't just acting out, it was a crime that involved courts. Your master could drag you before the authorities if you misbehaved, ran away, or even displayed stubbornness, a wonderfully vague Tudor offence that could apply to any child who had ever had a thought. The legal weight of apprenticeship made it one of the most serious decisions a Tudor family ever made. Parents essentially placed their child's fate into someone else's hands, trusting that the master would shape them into a skilled adult instead of a traumatized cautionary tale. And to the master, the contract was a long-term investment. An apprentice meant guaranteed labour, and while the child was supposed to be educated in a trade, the early years often looked suspiciously like free household work. But to the apprentice, it was a doorway into adulthood, though one that slammed shut behind them the moment the ink dried. Their old life ended. Their new life was ruled by a hierarchy that made sure they understood their place at the very bottom. And yet, for all its severity, apprenticeship was one of the few ladders available for Tudor children. If they made it to the end of their term, they emerged with a real shill and a real chance at independence, something most peasants could only dream of. That hope, distant and fragile though it was, fueled the entire system. Apprenticeship wasn't designed to make childhood pleasant, it was designed to give adulthood a fighting chance. So when a Tudor child became an apprentice, it wasn't a small step. It was a legally enforced leap into a future that promised hard work, limited freedom, and a skill that might, if the stars aligned, change their destiny. The good news, you really were learning a trade. The bad news, everything in your life from this moment forward was now someone else's decision. If you were a Tudor child about to begin an apprenticeship, the very first life lesson wasn't how to hammer a nail straight, or how to stir molten tallow without losing your eyebrows. No, the first lesson was leaving. Apprenticeship began with separation, a clean emotional amputation disguised as a career opportunity. In modern terms, it was like sending your kid to college, except that they were 9. There was no campus, no dorm, no electives, and no guarantee they'd ever come home again looking like the same person. In Tudor society, childhood was rooted in the home. Even though life was crowded, loud, and largely uncomfortable, the family unit was the emotional centre of everything. Children slept near their parents, learned from them, ate with them, and absorbed the rhythm of their household from birth. But apprenticeship shattered that rhythm. The moment the contract was signed, the child stopped being a member of one household and became a resident of another, sometimes miles away, sometimes in an entirely different town. That relocation wasn't symbolic. It was real, physical, and permanent until the term ended. If Tudor parents had a motto, it was, "We love you. Now pack your sackcloth, you're leaving at dawn." The emotional shock of this transition was enormous. Parents understood this, but they also believed it was necessary. Children weren't encouraged to cling to home, they were encouraged to grow up by removing themselves from it. Tears and hesitation were natural, but practicality always won. Apprenticeship was seen as the only route to a secure trade, a livelihood, and, if fortune smiled, the ability to support a family later on. In other words, cry now, prosper later. At least that was the hope. For the child, though, the journey from home to their master's house felt like crossing a border into a new and foreign country. The customs were different. The rules were different. Even the smells were different, usually worse. A master's house wasn't designed for comfort, it was designed for productivity. Gone were the familiar voices, the habits, the siblings who stole your bread but were still your companions. Now you entered a world where everyone outranked you, everybody expected something from you, and nobody cared if you were homesick. Travel itself was part of the rite of passage. Apprentices often walked to their new homes, carrying their few belongings in a bundle. For many, it was the farthest they had ever travelled from their birthplace. Roads weren't safe highways. They were unpredictable tracks filled with mud, merchants, farmers, beggars, and the occasional pig who had wandered away from its responsibilities. And every step took the child farther from the life they knew. Parents walked with them sometimes, but when the moment came to hand the child over, the farewell was swift. Tudor emotional expression was not known for its subtlety or length. A nod, a blessing, perhaps a reminder not to embarrass the family name, and that was that. But the rupture wasn't just emotional, it was social. A Tudor child's entire identity shifted the moment they were installed in their new household. They weren't treated as their parents' child anymore. They were treated as an apprentice, an outsider whose worth had to be earned through obedience and hard work. In the new household hierarchy, they ranked below everyone except the ashes in the fireplace. They had to learn the rhythms of this strange place, when to wake, when to speak, when to be sent, when to avoid standing in the master's line of sight because he was having one of his "don't annoy me today" moods. And unlike modern kids who can write home or call their parents when homesickness hits, Tudor apprentices had no convenient outlet. Letters were rare, travel was expensive, and free time was a myth. Many children didn't see their parents for years. Some didn't see them again until their apprenticeship ended. And some didn't see them again at all because Tudor life expectancy was unpredictable enough to make any long absence risky. Apprenticeship, in that sense, wasn't just a career. It was a gamble with fate. What makes this even more striking is how normal it was. For Tudor society, this wrenching separation wasn't a tragedy. It was a built-in feature of the system. It was understood that to become a functioning adult, you had to leave the nest abruptly and permanently. Home was where you were raised, but it wasn't where you would become someone. That transformation happened elsewhere, under the authority of a person who didn't love you, but was contractually obligated not to let you die. So when a Tudor child stepped through the doorway of their master's house for the first time, they weren't just entering a new building, they were entering a new identity. The boy or girl who had left home that morning ceased to exist. In their place stood an apprentice, small and uncertain, but legally bound to a future they had no choice but to accept. The good news? This was the beginning of opportunity. The bad news? That opportunity came with a permanent change of address. In Tudor England, choosing a career path wasn't a matter of personal exploration, inner calling, or the discovering your true passion after a life-changing gap year. No one asked young Thomas if he felt spiritually drawn to blacksmithing, or young Alice if textile work spoke to her soul. Your future trade emerged from a much simpler, far less poetic process. Whatever your parents could negotiate, afford, or desperately arrange became your destiny. The idea of finding your dream job was about as realistic as finding a unicorn with a strong work ethic. To understand how trades were assigned, imagine a marketplace where careers are swapped and bartered like produce. Parents weren't looking for a job that matched their child's interests. They were looking for a master willing to take the child at all. Economic need ruled everything. How much the family could pay up front, how many mouths were at home to feed, what trades were hiring that year, and whether anyone in the community owed them a favour. A child's skills, preferences, or enthusiasm ranked so low on the priority list that they didn't even make the list. If you had opposable thumbs, you were qualified enough. This matchmaking process wasn't instant. Parents asked around, listened for rumours of masters needing help, and attended market days where craftsmen circulated and talked business. Reputation mattered. A family wanted a master known for producing competent workers, not one known for setting apprentices on fire accidentally during lessons. But even when caution was used, options were always limited by the family's financial situation. If your parents were poor, you became whatever trade would take you, end of story. In wealthier households, there was a bit more flexibility. Merchant families might secure placements in trades connected to commerce or specialised crafts. But even then, the child's wishes were irrelevant. A son could daydream about becoming a musician, a scholar, or a court servant. But if the family business needed a cooper, then congratulations, your new life was barrel-shaped. Tudor practicality didn't entertain personal ambition unless it made economic sense. What made this particularly restrictive was the nature of the trades themselves. Each one was part of a guild, a powerful organisation that protected its craft through strict rules, training requirements, and membership limits. Guilds controlled who could practice a trade and how many apprentices a master could take. That meant the availability of positions wasn't based on community need or child interest, but on guild quotas, master preferences, and economic fluctuations. If the guild said only 3 new apprentices could enter the craft that year, then the 4th family in line was out of luck. Talent didn't matter. Timing did. And even when a position became available, masters were picky, though not in the way modern employers are. They weren't looking for passion or initiative. They were looking for children who seemed obedient, physically capable, and unlikely to give them trouble. A child who spoke too boldly might be rejected for fear they'd grow up into an apprentice with opinions, a terrifying thought. Meanwhile, quiet, sturdy children found themselves entrusted with trades they had never imagined. This was career planning Tudor style. Keep your head down, and maybe someone will hire it. Opportunities were also shaped by geography. If you lived in a rural village, your world of possible trades was small. You might end up learning basic crafts like carpentry, tailoring, or shoemaking simply because those were the only trades nearby. If you lived in a bustling town, you might have more options, but also far more competition. London apprenticeships were the most coveted, but they also came with the strictest expectations and the longest waiting lists. Parents sometimes sent their children far from home to secure a better trade, but only if they could afford the travel, the fees, and the risk of sending their child into a more demanding and more dangerous urban environment. Speaking of fees, the financial side of apprenticeship cannot be overstated. Many masters demanded a large sum of money up front as a sort of deposit or guarantee. This premium ensured the apprentice would be taken seriously and compensated the master for the cost of training, feeding and housing the child for several years. Poorer families often had to scrape together every coin they had and sometimes borrow from relatives or neighbours to pay these fees. This meant that your trade wasn't chosen by your natural aptitude. It was chosen by whatever price tag your parents could manage without crying too loudly. Even in cases where no premium was required, there were still costs: clothing, tools, boots, and sometimes even a symbolic gift for the master. Every item further narrowed the list of feasible trades. A child who dreamed of metalwork could be rejected because the family couldn't afford sturdy leather gloves. And thus many children found themselves in trades they had never once imagined, destined to spend the next 7 to 10 years mastering a skill that had entered their life solely by financial accident. So while Tudor apprentices eventually became skilled craftsmen and women, the early stage of their career wasn't shaped by interest or curiosity. It was shaped by negotiations, guild politics, family income, and luck. Some children ended up in trades that suited them perfectly. Others spent their lives wondering whether they might have been better off doing anything else. Dream jobs existed, yes, but only in the dreams of children who hadn't yet learned how Tudor society worked. In reality, your job chose you, and if it didn't, your parents made sure someone did. If the decision to send a child into apprenticeship felt heavy, the document that sealed it made the weight official: the indenture contract. This wasn't a friendly agreement sealed with a handshake and a hopeful pat on the back. This was a legally binding pledge, with enough stipulations, fine print, and behavioural warnings to make a modern rental lease look forgiving. The indenture locked an apprentice into years of unshakable obligations, and for many children, it lasted longer than the average Tudor marriage, which says less about the stability of contracts and more about the instability of spouses. The indenture spelled out in meticulous detail what the apprentice had to do, what they were forbidden to do, and what the master was required to provide in return. In theory, this was a fair exchange: labour and obedience for training and survival. In practice, the language was heavily weighted toward ensuring the apprentice understood just how little room they had to misbehave. Imagine a document that anticipated every possible poor decision you might make and banned them all. That was the indenture. First came the duration. 7 years was the standard minimum, though some trades demanded longer terms: 8, 9, even 10 years for particularly complex crafts. This wasn't measured in school years, this was measured in life years. A child might begin an apprenticeship at 8, and finish just before turning adulthood into something slightly less hypothetical. If you wanted a sense of just how monumental that was, consider this. The child entering the apprenticeship was almost certainly not the same person who would emerge. They grew up within the boundaries of this contract, moulded by its rules and its limitations. Next came the obligations. Apprentices were required to serve their masters faithfully, honestly, and obediently. A set of words repeated across countless indentures, each carrying the subtle implication that any deviation from perfect behaviour would be interpreted as personal betrayal. The apprentice had to obey every reasonable command, which conveniently left reasonable to the master's definition. They also had to guard the master's goods, avoid stealing, abstain from gossip, and generally conduct themselves like a model citizen who had no personal desires or recreational habits. Their loyalty was assumed, their freedom was not. But the real treasure trove of indentures was the long, often comically specific list of prohibitions. Apprentices were forbidden from gaming, a Tudor term for gambling, haunting taverns, staying out late, committing fornication, marrying, engaging in idle behaviour, or even keeping company with lewd persons, a category so broadly defined that it could include anyone from drunkards to anyone who enjoyed a bit too much conversation. These rules weren't aimed at piety, they were aimed at protecting the master's investment. A distracted, hungover, married, indebted, or morally compromised apprentice was a liability, and Tudor contracts made sure to cut temptation off at every angle. The penalties for violating these rules varied, but none were pleasant. An apprentice who broke their indenture could be physically punished, fined, dragged before the civic authorities, or even imprisoned. More commonly, the master simply extended the apprenticeship, adding additional months or years as punishment. Imagine working under strict supervision for 7 years, finally seeing the finish line, only for your master to announce, due to your poor decision to spend last Saturday in a tavern, we're adding 6 more months. Nothing crushed the soul quite like contractually mandated character development. Of course, the indenture also addressed the master's responsibilities, though with noticeably less enthusiasm. The master was expected to teach the apprentice the full craft, provide food, shelter, clothing, sometimes, and ensure the child avoided moral corruption. The master wasn't required to be kind, gentle, patient, or even remotely pleasant. They simply had to fulfill the bare minimum needed to keep the apprentice alive and teach them the trade. If they failed in these duties, the apprentice, or more realistically, the apprentice's parents, could appeal to a local guild or court, though the system overwhelmingly favoured the master. After all, children were not yet considered reliable witnesses in matters involving adults. The contract's power lay not just in its legal standing, but in the way it structured daily life. It acted as a shadow hovering over every moment of the apprenticeship. If the master gave a command, the indenture supported it. If the apprentice doubted whether something was allowed, the indenture explained why it wasn't. It made sure both parties knew that the apprentice wasn't just living in the master's house, they were living under the master's authority, with the law itself reinforcing the hierarchy. Breaking the indenture was nearly impossible without scandal or severe consequence. Running away was considered a serious offence, and a runaway apprentice could be legally hunted down and returned to their master. The indenture didn't simply organise labour, it bound the apprentice to a long journey from childhood to adulthood with no exit ramps. The contract began your training, defined your worth, determined your punishments, dictated your behaviour and protected your master's interests with unwavering loyalty. It wasn't romance, it wasn't partnership. It was a 7-year commitment to obedience, a marriage between a child and their future, officiated by ink, witnesses, and the unyielding expectations of Tudor society. The moment a Tudor apprentice crossed the threshold into their master's household, they stepped into a hierarchy so rigid it made feudalism feel like a suggestion. The indenture contract might not have literally transferred ownership of the apprentice's soul, but it came close enough to make the distinction feel symbolic rather than practical. A master didn't simply supervise apprentices, he governed them, controlled them, organised them, and when necessary, reminded them that their personal preferences were about as relevant as a crack chamber pot. The relationship between master and apprentice was not comparable to modern employee-employer dynamics. There were no performance reviews, no HR department, and certainly no healthy workplace boundaries. Apprentices weren't hired, they were absorbed into the master's world. Their time, energy, behaviour and potential were all assets the master could direct as he saw fit. If the master woke up in a bad mood, the apprentice's day was already ruined. If the master woke up in a good mood, the apprentice's day was slightly less ruined, but still full. Masters held sweeping authority rooted in law, tradition, guild power, and household structure. An apprentice had no independent standing. They couldn't negotiate wages, there weren't any. They couldn't question orders. They couldn't refuse tasks. This wasn't a partnership that trained future craftsmen. It was a custodial dictatorship in which the apprentice learned their place through relentless repetition. You didn't rise by ambition, you rose by endurance. To understand the master's power, imagine someone who could assign you work, scold you, punish you, take your free time, regulate your behaviour, monitor your companions, and decide whether your future career would thrive or fail. And all of this was considered normal. A master could wake an apprentice before dawn, loan them out to another craftsman for extra labour, or expect them to complete physically punishing jobs without complaint. The apprentice's time didn't belong to them. Their schedule was the master's schedule. Even the small passing moments of the day, Fetching water, tending fires, carrying goods, sweeping workshops were dictated entirely by the master's priorities. Apprentices were trained in the trade, yes, but that education was woven into the margins of a full workday. Any minute not spent learning was spent working, and any minute not spent working was considered suspicious. Beyond physical labour, the master also exercised moral authority. Apprentices were expected to model good behaviour, which meant behaving exactly as the master believed good behaviour looked. If an apprentice laughed too loudly, spoke too boldly, appeared too confident, or formed friendships deemed inappropriate, the master had the right to correct them. Correction in Tudor vocabulary meant disciplinary force ranging from stern lectures to physical punishment. And because apprentices were legally under the master's care, such discipline was encouraged as a moral responsibility rather than viewed as cruelty. Even the simple act of leaving the house required the master's permission. Apprenticeship wasn't confinement, but it was close enough to feel like it. Journeys outside were limited to errands, church attendance, and occasionally community events, where the master's eye, or at least the eyes of his neighbours, followed the apprentice's every move and condensat. Your freedom wasn't just limited, it was conditional. Everything you did outside the household reflected on your master, meaning everything was potentially punishable. What made this dynamic even more intense was the personal nature of the household structure. Apprentices didn't just work under the master, they lived with him. They saw him at meals, in the evenings, during chores, and at every moment in between. The master's moods, habits, temper, and expectations formed the apprentice's environment. If the master was fair and competent, life was manageable. If he was irritable, arrogant, or fond of shouting, the apprenticeship became a long-term endurance test in surviving authoritarian unpredictability. And because the master's authority extended beyond labour into identity, apprentices grew up learning how to read him, how to interpret a raised eyebrow, how to avoid provoking irritation, how to sense when the day would be difficult. Children who had barely learned to write their names suddenly became experts in emotional weather forecasting. Apprenticeship forced them to develop survival instincts that had nothing to do with the craft and everything to do with navigating the master's presence. Masters also controlled an apprentice's future. They decided how much training the apprentice received, when they received it, and whether they would emerge from the apprenticeship prepared to succeed or flounder. A master who resented or disliked an apprentice could sabotage their education, leaving them technically trained but practically disadvantaged. A master who appreciated diligence could open doors to connections, recommendations, and better prospects. In this way, an apprentice's fate rested heavily in the hands of someone they had no power over. There was no appealing the master's decisions. No guild would intervene unless the apprentice faced extreme abuse or blatant negligence. For the day-to-day realities, overwork, harsh words, arbitrary rules, or the master's questionable leadership, there was simply acceptance. Apprentices learned to internalize the system, obey first, question never, endure always. This wasn't ownership in the spiritual sense, but it was ownership in every practical sense. The apprentice belonged to the master's world, and their life revolved around his command. Their time wasn't theirs, their choices weren't theirs, their future, until the day they earned freedom, wasn't theirs. You weren't an employee, you were a supervised possession, and the supervision was constant. For a Tudor apprentice, the day didn't begin with a gentle rooster crowing or a leisurely stretch beneath warm blankets. It began with urgency. The first rule of survival was simple: beat the sun or be beaten by the consequences. Apprentices woke before dawn because morning wasn't a time of easing into the day, it was a deadline. If light touched the windows before you were already working, you were behind. And the master made sure you felt the shame of your tardiness in a way your spine wouldn't forget. The rhythm of an apprentice's day was shaped by two forces: the demands of the trade and the endless list of supporting chores that kept the workshop functioning. Work wasn't an isolated activity, it was a continuum. You didn't start at 9 and finish at 5. You started when the master thought productivity should begin, and stopped when your body quietly suggested death as an alternative. Before real training could even start, Apprentices were responsible for preparing the workspace. In a craftsman's world, the workshop wasn't a magical place where tools waited obediently like loyal soldiers. It was a cold, dark room filled with objects in constant need of maintenance. You swept the floors, you lit the fire if the trade required heat. You fetched water from wherever the nearest source was, even if it meant walking through half the town. You organised tools, cleaned benches, and prepared materials so the master could begin his work instantly. In Tudor logic, preparation wasn't a task, it was a moral obligation. Once the day officially began, the apprentice transitioned from household labour to craft labour. This wasn't glamorous. Apprentices didn't immediately jump into fine, delicate work. Instead, they handled the heaviest, dirtiest, almost repetitive tasks. If the trade involved wood, you carried timber and swept sawdust. If it involved metal, you pumped bellows and hauled fuel. If it involved cloth, you folded, stretched, and fetched whatever the journeyman demanded. And if the trade involved anything remotely unpleasant, smells, filth, heat, noise, congratulations, you were assigned to it. Journeymen hovered above you in the hierarchy, acting as the master's extensions. They often delegated the worst tasks with cheerful efficiency. Their instructions were blunt, their expectations unspoken, and their patience thin. They didn't mentor so much as direct traffic, and you were the traffic. By midday, you would have performed more physical labour than most modern people attempt in a week, and your reward was the privilege of continuing. Work varied depending on the craft, but the demands were universal. Your hands blistered, your arms ached, your legs stiffened from carrying, lifting, pushing, pulling, and standing for hours. This wasn't labour designed for comfort or even for safety. It was labour designed to keep the workshop productive every moment of the day. Tudor society didn't romanticise hard work, it weaponised it. And apprentices were the ammunition. Meals weren't breaks, they were interruptions. A quick bite of whatever the household provided, often coarse bread, ale, sometimes a stew, and then it was back to work. You didn't linger. You didn't sit and chat. You definitely didn't complain. The journeymen returned to their tasks, the master resumed overseeing or crafting, and the apprentice picked up the duties that had inconveniently paused for eating. The afternoon stretched ahead like an endurance test. Repetitive motions, heavy lifting, and the constant awareness that every mistake added time to an already endless day. One of the defining features of an apprentice's schedule was unpredictability. Tasks changed based on weather, materials available, customer demands, or the master's mood. One day you might be outside hauling goods to a market stall, the next you might be trapped in a smoky workshop stirring vats, hammering joints, or stitching leather, until your vision blurred. And because Tudor tools lacked the refinement of modern machinery, every task required more effort, more sweat, and more concentration. As daylight faded, the apprentice's responsibilities didn't end. Evening chores awaited, securing tools, extinguishing fires safely, cleaning the workshop so tomorrow's labour could begin without delay, and completing whatever last-minute tasks the master suddenly remembered. Even after the workshop closed, the household still needed maintaining. You might be asked to carry wood, fetch water again, assist in simple repairs, or run an errand before curfew. By the time the apprentice finally crawled into their sleeping space, often a pallet near the fire or a shared loft, they weren't resting so much as collapsing. The repetition and physicality of this routine created an unspoken understanding among apprentices. Suffering wasn't a side effect of training, it was the training. Your body adapted because it had no choice. Your muscles developed because they were always in use. Your endurance grew because stopping was rarely an option. If you wanted to survive, you matched the rhythm of the workshop and ignored whatever protests your joints filed each night. Yet for all its difficulty, this structure shaped the core of apprenticeship. It wasn't about teaching skills in isolation. It was about forging reliability, training the body as much as the mind, ensuring that when you eventually became a journeyman or a master yourself, you could endure the full demands of the craft from dawn until the workshop surrendered to darkness. In the Tudor world, time belonged to productivity, and for the apprentice that meant every waking moment belonged to the master. If the sun was up, you were already late. And if your back gave up before the end of the day, well, there was always tomorrow to try collapsing less dramatically. If modern apprenticeships emphasise mentorship, guided practice, and structured skill building, Tudor apprenticeships emphasise something far simpler: standing near the master and desperately trying not to ruin anything. Forget hands-on learning. Tudor skill acquisition followed a method that could be summarised as: watch every movement your master makes, memorise it, and pray you understand it before anyone forces you to repeat it for real. Observation wasn't just the first stage of learning, it was the entire foundation. This wasn't because masters believed deeply in the power of visual education. It was because letting apprentices handle tools early on was a fast way to lose valuable materials, destroy expensive work, or accidentally set something on fire. Apprentices were kept at a cautious distance from anything of value until the master could confidently say, yes, this child now knows the difference between hold and drop. So the apprentice's training began with standing beside the master, beside journeymen, beside benches, beside tools they weren't allowed to touch. They watched techniques repeated hundreds of times: the angle of a carving knife, the rhythm of a hammer stroke, the careful dipping of fabric into dye, the steady stirring of heat materials. An apprentice learned the trade the same way a squirrel learns traffic patterns, by observing and hoping their instincts developed before disaster struck. Patience was required. Apprenticeship wasn't designed for speed. Masters had paying customers, unpredictable workloads, seasonal obligations, and the never-ending need to produce consistent results. Teaching an apprentice required time they often didn't have, so training became a long-term background project. Apprentices absorbed skills at the edge of the master's vision, while completing practical tasks in the margins. When apprentices finally moved past observation and into hands-on practice, the transition was rarely gentle. A master didn't hand over an expensive piece of material and say, "Give it a try." Instead, they gave the apprentice scraps, damaged wood, leftover metal, worn-out textiles, and said something like, "Do as I do." And the apprentice tried, and failed, and tried again, and failed again, and eventually succeeded just enough to stop worrying about being expelled or scolded into a new hairline. Journeymen played a major role in this process, but not necessarily as teachers. Their instruction style typically fell into two categories: rapid demonstrations followed by "you should know this by now," or vague gestures accompanied by frustration when the apprentice interpreted them incorrectly. If the master embodied authority, the journeymen embodied impatience. Their job wasn't to mould apprentices, it was to keep the workshop moving. If an apprentice slowed that movement, even by asking a question at the wrong time, the response was swift and loud. And then there was the yelling, not optional, not occasional, but foundational. Yelling was the Tudor version of a training manual. It communicated error, urgency, and disappointment all in one sound wave. Apprentices grew accustomed to hearing their name called sharply across the workshop, often followed by a critique of something they hadn't even realised they'd done, or hadn't done, or had done too slowly, or too quickly, or simply while breathing in the master's direction. But yelling didn't always mean incompetence. Sometimes it meant the master cared enough to ensure the apprentice learned correctly. Noise was part of the educational atmosphere. A quiet workshop wasn't peaceful. It meant the master had left, the journeymen were focused, and the apprentice was mercifully invisible. Learning through watching wasn't entirely disadvantageous. It forced apprentices to develop sharp observational skills. They learned to read body movements, anticipate steps, and understand timing. They learned that every craft had a flow. Misjudge it, and you ruined the work. Follow it, and the task unfolded almost naturally. Apprentices developed instincts long before they developed confidence. Whether shaping wood, hammering metal, preparing dyes, or assembling goods, they built an internal library of techniques simply by existing in the master's working orbit. Still, the most challenging part of observation-based learning was the constant pressure. Apprentices were always aware that their mistakes had consequences, not just for themselves, but for the workshop. break a tool, the master lost money, spoil materials. That cost might come out of the household's limited resources. Delay a job, customers complained. An apprentice rarely feared failure in the abstract. They feared the chain reaction it could trigger. As the years went on, apprentices graduated from scraps to simple tasks, from simple tasks to moderate ones, and eventually to skilled work under supervision. When a master finally trusted the apprentice to contribute to real production, it was a moment of triumph, though rarely acknowledged with praise. Masters didn't celebrate progress, they simply stopped hovering. In Tudor training, dance was the closest thing to approval. By the end of their apprenticeship, an apprentice had learned not only the craft, but the unspoken rules that governed it. The pace, the posture, the timing, the expectations. They learned the trade not from instruction, but from immersion. Watching, waiting, practicing, enduring. Every lesson was embedded in repetition, developed through patience and reinforced by occasional screaming. Step 1, watch. Step 2, don't touch. Step 3, get blamed anyway. Step 4, if you're lucky, become skilled enough that someone else gets yelled at instead. If modern apprentices learn through encouragement, constructive feedback and gentle correction, Tudor apprentices learned through a system best described as motivational violence. In a world where obedience was valued more than comfort and efficiency mattered more than childhood feelings, discipline wasn't just a tool, it was the backbone of the entire apprenticeship structure. Mistakes weren't teaching moments, they were punishable events, and every apprentice quickly discovered that the fastest way to improve performance was to avoid the object currently swinging toward their backside. Punishment wasn't considered cruelty, it was considered necessary maintenance, like sharpening tools or stirring a pot to prevent burning. A master's authority depended on immediate correction, and that correction often came in the form of implements conveniently located around the workshop. Wooden sticks, long handles, scraps of leather, broom shafts, anything straight, sturdy and within reach. A master didn't need to search far for disciplinary instruments. The workplace was fully stocked. Tudor society believed deeply in hierarchy, and physical punishment reinforced that hierarchy better than any contract. If an apprentice hesitated, talked back, worked slowly, fumbled a task, or simply stood where the master didn't want them to stand, a swift strike reminded them of their place. The idea wasn't to injure the apprentice permanently, but to adjust their behaviour in the quickest and most memorable way possible. And memory was indeed enhanced. Pain tends to do that. But not all punishments involved hitting. There were other varieties of suffering a master could dispense. Some made apprentices kneel for long periods on hard surfaces, a task that turned even the strongest knees into trembling protests. Others doubled or tripled workloads, forcing apprentices to redo their work under exhausting conditions. Some were denied food, sleep, or breaks. A master might order an apprentice to stand motionless in a corner for an hour while the workshop bustled around them, a humiliating reminder that their agency had temporarily been revoked. And then there was shouting, a form of punishment that left no physical mark but delivered emotional bruises with surprising efficiency. A master's raised voice could slice through the workshop like a thrown axe. Apprentices endured scoldings that echoed off stone walls, filled with accusations of carelessness, stupidity, or laziness. Journeymen sometimes joined in, creating a chorus of disappointment. The apprentice, standing helplessly with whatever tool they'd mishandled, learned quickly that humiliation was as integral to training as any craft technique. The severity of punishment varied widely from household to household. Some masters were known for temperate correction, firm but controlled, believing discipline should teach rather than terrorize. Others were infamous for unpredictable moods and a strong throwing arm. Apprentices learned to observe the master's facial expressions the way sailors watched clouds for signs of storms. A clenched jaw meant caution, a muttered complaint meant imminent danger, and if the master sighed loudly while inspecting a piece of work, everyone in the workshop braced for impact. Punishment also served a social function. Apprentices weren't isolated learners, They were part of a household, and their behaviour reflected on the master. If an apprentice acted out in public or embarrassed the workshop, the resulting punishment was practically a community event. A master who failed to discipline an unruly apprentice risked damaging his reputation. Apprenticeship wasn't just about producing skilled workers. It was about producing disciplined adults who could function reliably within the system. Discipline, therefore, wasn't considered optional. It was considered moral. But as much as punishment hurt, it had another purpose. It shaped the apprentice into someone who obeyed reflexively. When the master called, you ran. When the master handed you something, you took it without hesitation. When the master pointed at a job, you performed it before he could explain. This instinct wasn't merely encouraged, it was conditioned. Over time, apprentices became keenly aware of their surroundings, anticipating mistakes before they happened to avoid enduring yet another educational blow to the backside. And yet, strangely, apprentices often grew attached to their masters despite the harshness. Not because they enjoyed being disciplined, no one enjoyed that, but because the master's authority was tied to their survival. A master who punished also fed, housed, trained, and supported the apprentice through years of development. In a world without emotional subtlety, affection expressed itself through consistency rather than gentleness. Many apprentices later looked back at their punishments as just how things were, not as abuses, but as rites of passage. It was the Tudor version of character building, painful, direct, and utterly unromantic. Still, the physical reality couldn't be denied. Apprentices carried the marks of their mistakes on their bodies, bruises on arms from mishandled tools, welts from swift corrections, swollen knees from prolonged kneeling. Their hands toughened into calloused maps of their training. Their backs developed aches that began early and lasted decades. These weren't just bodily changes. They were tokens of apprenticeship, proof that learning had consequences. And perhaps most telling of all was the silence around punishment. Apprentices didn't complain. Journeymen didn't interfere. Parents rarely intervened. Discipline was accepted as an unavoidable part of learning. You didn't protest it, you survived it. Because in the Tudor world, teaching wasn't measured in patience, encouragement, or nurturing guidance. Teaching was measured in how many times an apprentice remembered a mistake well enough never to repeat it. Feedback was immediate, and usually wooden. If a Tudor apprentice had written a diary, and if they had the time, literacy, or energy left in their hands to hold a quill, one entry would have appeared every single day. I ate. I regret it. Because while the indenture contract promised that masters would feed their apprentices, it never promised what. Food was provided because the law demanded it. Nutrition, flavour, or emotional comfort were luxuries the law never mentioned. Apprentices survived on meals that were technically edible, questionably appetizing, and spiritually disappointing. Food distribution followed the same hierarchy that governed everything else. The master and his family ate first. They received the best cuts, the hotter servings, the fresher bread, and anything that could be described using the phrase actual food. Journeymen ate next, sharing in whatever remained of the prepared meal. Apprentices? They waited at the end of the line, not unlike hopeful pigeons eyeing the crumbs of human civilization. If anything was left, it was theirs. If not, well, apprentices learned early that hunger built character. The staple of an apprentice's diet was bread. Not the fluffy, fresh, golden-crusted loaves that appear in modern bakeries as if they've been kissed by angels, but the kind of bread that made your jaw question its life choices. Apprentices usually received cheat bread, a lower-quality loaf bulked out with cheaper grains, bran, peas, or anything that could stretch the dough. Sometimes it included rye or oats. Sometimes it included ingredients that defied identification. It was dry, it was tough. It was filling purely because digestion required your stomach to work overtime, burning more energy than the bread offered. Bread was often paired with pottage, the medieval answer to what happens if you boil something until it stops resisting. Pottage was a mushy stew of grains, vegetables, maybe a scrap of meat if fortune smiled, and a flavour profile best described as warm. Apprentices ate it daily because meals needed to be cheap, repetitive, and extraordinarily easy to make in large quantities. If pottage had variations, apprentices rarely encountered them. The master's household might occasionally enjoy a richer version with herbs, onions, or a decent broth. The apprentice's share resembled a beige moral lesson. Meat was a rare visitor. Apprentices saw it often enough to remember what it looked like, but not often enough to remember what it tasted like. When meat did appear, it was usually in slivers, shavings of salted pork, bits of beef boiled until surrender, or pieces of fish whose freshness ranged from optimistic to "don't smell that." Bones were more common than flesh, and apprentices became experts at extracting every possible nutrient from scraps that had already served the family and journeyman well. On days when the household was stretched thin, or the workshop had been especially busy, apprentices might find themselves eating leftovers reheated beyond recognition. The Tudor solution to food safety was not refrigeration, it was overcooking. If a stew had become questionable, the mistress simply boiled it again. If tomorrow it became more questionable, she boiled it harder. Apprentices ate it anyway, because the only other option was fainting at work, which the master considered unhelpful. Ale was the standard drink, not the hearty pub ale you're imagining, but a weak, low-alcohol brew consumed because the water was often unsafe. Apprentices drank it daily, though rarely in quantities large enough to inspire joy. The household saved the stronger, better ale for adults. Apprentices received the diluted version, the liquid equivalent of being told, "don't get too comfortable." Seasonal foods sometimes brightened the monotony. In summer, apprentices might eat beans, peas, or garden vegetables when available. In autumn, perhaps apples or onions. But these glimpses of variety were accidental, not intentional. No one planned meals with apprentices in mind. They received whatever the household needed to discard or stretch. And then there was fasting. The church calendar demanded numerous fasting days during which meat was forbidden. For masters, this meant adjusting menus. For apprentices, it meant eating the same pottage as always, but with the comfort of knowing everyone else was also pretending to enjoy it. What makes the apprentice diet particularly striking is how it reflected their social position. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was hierarchy on a plate. A child in apprenticeship was not yet a full member of the household, and their meals proved it daily. Good food symbolized status. Apprentices received the bare minimum because their role was to serve, learn, and endure, not to indulge. Even during feasts or holidays, apprentices might be allowed leftovers from the upper table, but only after every higher-ranking person had eaten. A feast for a master was a good day. A feast for an apprentice was a slightly better bowl of the same old pottage. Despite its limitations, the diet served its purpose. It kept apprentices alive enough to work. Barely. They developed strong stomachs out of necessity. Their bodies adjusted to repetition. Their expectations lowered to survivable levels. And occasionally a scrap of roasted meat, a slice of decent bread, a spoonful of thicker stew felt so luxurious it rivaled riches. The good news? Apprentices ate every day. The bad news? Most of what they ate was bread's sad cousin, swimming in a bowl of edible disappointment. If a Tudor apprentice ever dreamed of a soft feather mattress, warm blankets, or a private room, those dreams were swiftly corrected by reality. The same reality that had them waking before dawn, being yelled at by journeymen, and eating bread that doubled as a construction material. Because for an apprentice, sleep wasn't so much a nightly ritual as it was an afterthought, squeezed between exhaustion and the next day's suffering. Masters provided lodging because the contract said they must. Comfort, however, remained optional. The first thing to understand is this: space was scarce. Tudor homes were not built with extra rooms in mind. They were designed to house families, store goods, host workshops and protect tools, not cater to the comfort of newcomers, especially tiny newcomers whose labour was considered more valuable than their personal space. As a result, apprentice sleeping arrangements required creativity. In fact, They bordered on architectural improvisation. Some apprentices slept in the workshop itself, not because it was relaxing to drift off beside tools you weren't allowed to touch, but because it was the only available space not already claimed by a family member. Sleeping in a workshop meant inhaling fumes from the day's activities, being surrounded by objects capable of injuring you in your sleep, and occasionally sharing the room with vermin, who also felt entitled to the premises. If there was a fire in the hearth to heat tools, the apprentice slept near it, not for luxury, but because it was better than freezing. Other apprentices slept in loft areas and cramped upper floor spaces accessible by narrow ladders or stairways that groaned under the weight of Tudor life. These lofts weren't cosy attics. They were dusty, low-ceilinged crawl spaces where apprentices curled themselves into efficient shapes to avoid hitting beams. The bedding ranged from straw pallets to bags stuffed with reeds, and the smell ranged from damp to damp with personality. Privacy was non-existent. You shared the loft with other apprentices, discarded tools, and whatever the household needed to store out of sight. Floor sleeping was another common arrangement. Apprentices might roll out a thin mat or a bundle of cloth in a corner of the main room after the family went to bed. This meant waiting until everyone else settled before claiming your patch of floor, which often resulted in the apprentice falling asleep to the soothing nighttime noises of Tudor family life: coughing, arguing, snoring, and the occasional sound of someone emptying a chamber pot. This next morning you had to rise earlier than everyone else, not only because work awaited, but because your bed was in the middle of the household's traffic pattern. In the smallest or poorest households, creativity reached peak levels. An apprentice might sleep on a bench under a table near the foot of the master's bed, or in the narrow gap between stored goods. If the workshop produced heat, like those of smiths, bakers, or metalworkers, apprentices sometimes slept near ovens or forges for warmth. This was both comforting and mildly dangerous, but warmth was warmth. Bedding materials rarely improved the situation. Feather mattresses were for wealthier families. Wool-stuffed pads were for middle households. Apprentices, they received what can only be described as flattened optimism, a pallet stuffed with straw which needed regular changing unless you wanted a mattress full of insects, mould, and medieval aroma. Straw mattresses shifted constantly, poking their occupant with stalks whenever they dared to get comfortable. Linen sheets were a luxury few apprentices experienced. Blankets often consisted of coarse wool that scratched more than it insulated. And then there was the cold. Tudor England was not known for insulation. Walls were draughty, windows barely existed, and fires were rationed carefully for safety and expense. Apprentices slept with their clothes nearby, sometimes on, and hoped the thin blanket provided enough warmth to prevent shivering from becoming an all-night hobby. In winter, breath turned visible, and frost sometimes formed on the walls. Sleeping in these conditions didn't refresh you, it preserved you. Noise was another adversary. Apprentices didn't get private quarters. They shared spaces with other workers, family members, or household animals. Dogs barked, babies cried, adults argued about money, crops, neighbours, church attendance, or anything else worth arguing about. Workshops creaked, timbers popped. The entire house settled and resettled, as if determined to keep the apprentice awake. If you complained, you learned quickly that complaining did not produce quieter nights. It simply produced extra chores. Yet despite the discomfort, apprentices adapted. Human endurance is remarkable, and Tudor children had no choice but to normalise conditions that would inspire modern outrage. Over time, apprentices learned to fall asleep anywhere, on pallets, floors, benches, straw, or whatever surface remained horizontal and unoccupied. They learned the art of waking instantly when called, of ignoring discomfort, and of treating exhaustion not as a barrier but as a daily companion. The sleeping arrangements also reinforced hierarchy. The apprentice slept where the family did not. Their space was flexible because their status was flexible. Occupying the lowest rung meant accommodating everyone else. You learned early that comfort wasn't promised, rest wasn't guaranteed, but survival was built into the system. In the end, apprentice lodging was never meant to pamper. It was meant to house, barely. Comfort had to wait until apprenticeship ended, and even then, only if you earned enough to afford a bed that was more than a philosophical concept. You didn't have a bed, you had a suggestion of rest. If you were a Tudor apprentice, cleanliness existed in a curious state of contradiction. On paper, masters demanded it. Household rules insisted upon it. Guilds expected apprentices to maintain it. But reality looked at cleanliness, laughed politely, and replaced it with a thin layer of grime that coated apprentices from head to toe like a protective medieval seasoning. The expectation was simple enough. Apprentices needed to look presentable. Not elegant, not even especially tidy, but not embarrassing by Tudor standards. This meant clean hands, a washed face, and clothing brushed free of the day's debris. The problem was that apprentice life actively sabotaged these goals every waking moment. When you work with tools, materials, smoke, dust, dyes, flour, leather, wood shavings, metal filings, or anything that produces dirt, which is to say everything, you become a walking portfolio of your craft. And the Tudor approach to hygiene didn't help. Bathing was neither common nor simple. Water had to be heated manually, tubs had to be filled bucket by bucket, and privacy didn't exist unless you were wealthy. For most households, full-body bathing happened seasonally. Yes, seasonally, as in when the weather permitted, and the household felt motivated enough to wrestle with several gallons of water. Apprentices didn't rank high enough on the bathing priority list to receive frequent scrubbing privileges. A master's children might bathe semi-regularly. Apprentices? They got the leftovers of both water and attention. So apprentices relied on what historians call partial washing, splashing water on their face and hands, neck, and anything else visible to customers or the public. The goal was not cleanliness. It was optics. If you looked clean, people assumed you were clean enough. Beneath the collar and sleeves, however, an ecosystem thrived that modern microbiologists would describe as alarmingly vibrant. Their work only added to the challenge. If you were apprenticed to a blacksmith, soot embedded itself in your skin so deeply that it became a personality trait. Tanners soaked hides in chemicals that made even fresh air smell suspicious. Bakers became dust clouds of flour. Carpenters collected sawdust in their hair like festive confetti. Weavers inhaled fibres until their clothing and lungs matched. Apprentices who handled dyes spent their days stained in shades not found on any natural human. No matter how often you rinsed your face, your work branded you. Clothing hygiene followed similar patterns. Apprentices rarely owned more than a couple of outfits, and those outfits worked harder than they did. They were worn during labour, meals, errands, sleep, and anything in between. Laundry wasn't a daily or even weekly ritual. It happened when the clothing reached a certain threshold of offensiveness, or when the household finally needed the garment for something else. Washing clothing required soap, expensive water, heavy labour, time-consuming and drying space limited. Masters didn't waste resources ensuring the apprentice had freshly laundered attire. A quick brushing or shaking usually counted as cleaning. Hair care followed the same minimalist philosophy. Long hair gathered filth, but shaving the head was not always fashionable or permitted. Apprentices kept their hair tied back, brushed out when possible, and occasionally rinsed in cold water. Combs existed, yes, but so did lice. And while lice weren't considered a personal failing, they were an inconvenience that apprentices often found themselves responsible for remedying through various dubious remedies involving vinegar, herbs, or sheer hope. Smells were another unavoidable dimension of apprentice hygiene. Body odour wasn't a sign of neglect. It was a sign you were alive and working. Workshops carried their own aromas, and apprentices absorbed them with the enthusiasm of a sponge. If you worked with heat, you smelled like smoke. If you worked with animals, you smelled like animals. If you worked in a kitchen, you smelled like food, although rarely the good parts. Apprentices developed a scent profile that was less fresh breeze and more historically accurate. Despite all this, hygiene expectations still mattered. Masters expected apprentices to look tidy enough to represent the household with dignity. Customers needed to feel they were interacting with someone capable, not a mud sculpture that had wandered into town by mistake. The church insisted on cleanliness during Sundays, which meant apprentices scrubbed themselves more thoroughly before attending services, partly for piety, mostly because everyone else would be able to smell them at close range. Water access dictated a great deal. In towns, public wells or pump stations provided water, but required walking and carrying, tasks frequently assigned to apprentices. Fetching water gave the illusion that apprentices had ample access to cleanliness, but carrying water for others did not magically translate into water for themselves. By the time the household finished using it for cooking, washing dishes, scrubbing floors, or other chores, little remained for personal hygiene, and yet, apprentices adapted. They developed daily routines that balanced survival with social expectations. A quick morning rinse to appear awake, a midday hand wash when customers were expected, a brushing of clothes to hide the worst of the grime. On special occasions or feast days, apprentices might even receive permission to bathe properly, an event so monumental that they might go to bed afterward feeling like entirely new people, or at least people temporarily less crusty. To be a Tudor apprentice was to accept that dirt was not a failure, it was an identity. Cleanliness was encouraged, yes, but rarely fully achieved. Apprentices learned to carry their grime with dignity, because the alternative was unrealistic, and if anyone complained, well, apprentices always had the perfect excuse. They weren't filthy. They were historically authentic. In Tudor England, clothing wasn't just fabric, it was a hierarchy you could wear. Every thread, every colour, every inch of trim announced your social position before you even opened your mouth. And if you were a Tudor apprentice, your clothing announced only one thing. You were nobody yet. Not a gentleman, not a tradesman, not even a full member of the household. You were an almost person, visually coded for easy identification in the social food chain. This wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. Tudor society relied on strict visual separation to maintain order, and apprentices sitting at the very bottom of the workshop ladder were dressed accordingly. Masters provided the clothing because the indenture required it, but the law didn't say anything about quality. So apprentices received garments that could survive constant work. Harsh weather, dirt, tools, chores, and teenage growth spurts, meaning they were sturdy, boring, coarse, and about as fashionable as a sack with sleeves. Let's begin with the fabric. Apprentices wore wool, not the soft, delicate kind used by wealthy families. No, they wore the type of wool that still felt vaguely related to the sheep it came from. It was thick, itchy, durable, and only soft after years of wearing it down. If you were fortunate, you might get linen shirts beneath the wool to soften the discomfort. If you weren't, your skin simply built character, one irritation at a time. Colours were equally uninspiring. Apprentices were typically dressed in muted browns, greys, dull greens, or anything that looked like it had lost a fight with a dye vat. Bright or expensive colours, crimson, deep blue, rich black, were reserved for those of higher rank or stronger bank accounts. Sumptuary laws enforced who could wear what, but even without them, no master was going to waste good dye on an apprentice who spent their days sweating, staining, tearing, and accidentally igniting parts of their wardrobe while assisting in the workshop. The cut of apprentice clothing was equally practical. Tunics were loose because work required movement. Hose or simple breeches were plain because apprentices climbed ladders, hauled goods, and knelt on floors more often than they stood still. Doublets, the fitted jackets worn by men of the period, were simplified and padded mostly to protect the fabric, not the apprentice. Nothing was decorative. Everything was functional. If your outfit looked remotely stylish, it was either an accident or a hand-me-down from a journeyman who had outgrown it. Footwear was another joyless affair. Imagine shoes stiff enough to argue with your feet and soles so thin you could feel every cobblestone judging your life choices. Apprentices needed shoes durable enough for constant work, but masters were not about to splurge on leather luxuries. So the shoes were basic, heavy, often patched, and occasionally so ill-fitting they developed a personality of their own. Socks? If provided, they were coarse wool and only slightly less itchy than wearing sandpaper. And heaven help the apprentice who hoped to accessorize. Belts existed only to hold tools or to keep clothing from falling off. Hats were permitted, but plain, wide-brimmed if you worked outdoors, cap-like if you worked inside. Anything too distinctive risked implying individuality, and individuality was not something the system wanted apprentices to display. The goal was to blend in, behave, and look like someone's responsibility rather than someone's equal. Clothing wasn't just about limiting personal expression, it reinforced hierarchy within the workshop. Journeymen often dressed better than apprentices, with sturdier fabrics or deeper colours. Their clothing announced their rising status and skill. The master dressed a level above that, wearing the finer materials and tailored pieces that proclaimed authority before he even spoke. An apprentice didn't need to be told where they ranked. They could see it every time they stood beside a journeyman and noticed that the journeyman's tunic had buttons that actually matched. Even outside the workshop, apprentice clothing served as a social label. When an apprentice ran errands, everyone knew at a glance who they were. Merchants priced their tone accordingly. Townspeople addressed them with a mix of dismissal and expectation. Potential troublemakers stayed alert, because apprentices were often blamed first when something went wrong. Wearing plain, durable clothing was like carrying a little sign that said, "This person is supervised, under contract, poorly paid, and probably tired." Of course, clothing also wore out quickly. Apprentices worked long hours, handled rough materials, and spent their days in environments that treated fabric with hostility. Tears, holes, stains, burns, and stretched seams were part of the daily experience. Masters repaired clothing sparingly. Apprentices learned to mend their own garments, patching elbows until they resembled quilts, sewing hems reinforced more by hope than thread. Clothing lasted as long as the apprentice could keep it from disintegrating, often through sheer force of will. Despite all of this, apprentice clothing carried a symbolic purpose. It marked you as someone in the process of becoming. You weren't allowed the dignity of a tradesman's garments because you hadn't earned the dignity of a tradesman's authority. You dressed plainly because you were still unfinished, economically, socially, and professionally. Dressing above your station wasn't just frowned upon, it was considered dishonest, presumptuous, and sometimes illegal. And so, every morning, when a Tudor apprentice pulled on their scratchy tunic, stiff shoes, and drab colours, they weren't just getting dressed for work. They were stepping into a visual contract, a reminder that fashion existed in the Tudor world, but apprentices were not invited to participate. Not yet, not until the day they earned it. If a Tudor apprentice ever used the phrase free time, it was probably as a joke, one they didn't have enough breath left to laugh at. In theory, apprentices were human beings with bodies that needed rest, and minds that occasionally required a moment of peace. In practice, they were contractual extensions of their master's will, and any time not spent working was spent being prepared to work again. Leisure existed only as a philosophical concept like fairness or beds without splinters. The indenture contract never promised apprentices recreation. It promised them food, lodging, and training, and all three were interpreted with the stingiest level of generosity legally permitted. The master had complete authority over the apprentice's schedule. If the master needed something, water fetched, tools mended, materials sorted, the apprentice's day adjusted immediately. There was no moment when an apprentice could declare, "I'm off duty." Off duty was a euphemism for sleeping, and even that was occasionally interrupted when the master remembered something urgently inconvenient. Most apprentices' days were shaped by the perpetual pressure of tasks waiting to be done. After all the morning chores, after the workshop labour, after the errands, after the evening clean-up, and after the last instructions from the master had finally ceased echoing, apprentices might theoretically have a sliver of unwatched time before collapsing into sleep. But sliver is generous. It was more like the thin crust of life's pie, granted only if nothing delayed the day's work. The fundamental problem wasn't simply the workload, it was the constant supervision. Apprentices lived in the master's household, and therefore under the master's eye. Even if the master wasn't physically present, the journeymen served as secondary wardens. Apprentices could rarely move without someone noting where they were going, how long they had been gone, and whether they looked suspiciously happy about it. Leisure was allowed only if it served a moral purpose. Attending church, visiting family on rare occasions, or participating in community festivities deemed respectable. Going anywhere else required explicit permission. An apprentice couldn't simply wander into town, stroll through a market, or visit a friend. Doing so risked accusations of idleness, misbehaviour, or, worse, fun. If someone saw an apprentice lingering by a tavern door or talking animatedly with strangers, the gossip would reach the master before the apprentice did. And once it did, punishment followed swiftly. Not for the activity itself, but for the audacity of thinking one's time belonged to oneself. Even Sundays, the closest thing apprentices had to leisure days, were heavily regulated. Church attendance was mandatory. The master expected apprentices to present themselves neatly, sit still, and behave with modesty. Afterward, apprentices might enjoy a few hours of freedom if they were lucky, but freedom in Tudor England meant carefully monitored socialising. No gambling, no rowdy games. No drinking in taverns, no wandering too far, and definitely no behaviour that implied joy unconnected to religious devotion. If the master trusted the apprentice, the day might be quiet and uneventful. If not, the apprentice could be required to run household errands even on the Sabbath. Festivals and feast days offered greater opportunities for fun, but apprentices still navigated them with boundaries. They could watch performances, join dances, or participate in harmless games, but only within the approved spaces and only under the implied expectation that they would conduct themselves like miniature adults. Apprentices who became too enthusiastic, shouting during festivities, cheering a bit too loudly, or winning at a game in a way that suggested suspicious happiness, found themselves reined in quickly. Journeymen, meanwhile, had genuine leisure. They went drinking, visited friends, played games, courted women, and engaged in activities limited only by curfews and guild reputation. Apprentices watched this freedom from a distance, mentally taking notes for the day they too might enjoy such luxuries. But for now, they remained at the bottom of the hierarchy, visible, controlled, responsible for being on hand whenever needed. Even private amusement was difficult. Apprentices might try to carve a bit of wood into a toy, hum a tune while working, or tell stories quietly at night with other apprentices, but all of this depended on not attracting attention. Laughter was suspicious. Relaxation was suspicious. Looking like you weren't in pain was especially suspicious. A happy apprentice suggested a lazy apprentice. And laziness was the mortal enemy of Tudor households. Occasionally, apprentices found rare moments of unstructured time, perhaps late at night when the household slept, perhaps in the few minutes between chores. These moments were fragile and fleeting. Apprentices might sit quietly, stretch aching limbs, whisper to one another, or simply breathe in a way that didn't involve rushing. Even these simple things felt decadent. A moment of stillness was the closest thing they had to leisure, and even that carried risk. In fact, the greatest limitation wasn't the lack of time, it was the lack of ownership over that time. Apprentices didn't decide when they rested, visited, socialised, or enjoyed themselves. Every minute existed with the understanding that someone else could claim it at any moment. Any freedom they had lasted only as long as no one needed them, which was rarely longer than the time it took for the master to remember a task. Thus, freedom, for a Tudor apprentice, was not a state of being. It was a temporary glitch in the system. You had spare time. It just wasn't yours. If there was one thing Tudor masters feared more than laziness, more than accidents, more even than apprentices who asked too many questions, it was unsupervised enjoyment. Nothing sent a chill down a responsible master's spine quite like the thought of an apprentice near a tavern, a gambling table, or, heaven forbid, a group of young people laughing. To a Tudor adult, fun was a gateway activity. First came the dice, then the ale, then moral collapse, then inevitably someone ended up with a broken tool, a missing coin purse, or a sudden need to find new employment in a different town. so apprentice indentures included behavioural restrictions thick enough to serve as doorstops. These clauses forbade gambling, drinking, carousing, swearing, keeping evil company, and anything else a lawyer could list before his ink dried. The rules didn't read like guidelines for teenagers. They read like commandments for small children trapped inside teenage bodies. And apprentices were teenagers, or close enough to dream of rebellion, but too bound by contract to successfully achieve it. Taverns were the epicenter of moral panic. They were loud, lively, and filled with people who were neither invested in your future nor concerned with how sober your master expected you to be the next morning. Taverns were where gossip flowed faster than ale, where tradesmen mingled freely, and where pockets occasionally emptied themselves without warning. Apprentices were strictly forbidden from entering them, not because the ale was dangerous, but because everything else was. Drinks loosened tongues created trouble created punishment, and punishment created more excuses for masters to cite their indenture like a holy text. But taverns were also fun, and fun was sorely lacking in an apprentice's life. So naturally, many apprentices tried to experience tavern culture anyway, but stealthily, strategically, and always with the understanding that being caught meant consequences painful enough to be remembered several anniversaries later. Gambling too sat high on the list of forbidden pleasures. Dice games were everywhere, on street corners, in alleyways, in taverns, behind workshops. Beneath market stalls, you could gamble with coins, with scraps, with promises, or with anything two bored young men could agree to call stakes. Masters feared gambling because it encouraged apprentices to lose money they didn't have, create debts they couldn't repay, and form friendships with people the master absolutely did not approve of. To the Tudor mind, dice were essentially weapons disguised as entertainment. They didn't kill bodies, they killed discipline. This meant that apprentices who wished to gamble had to become experts in operating under the radar. Small groups gathered out of sight, behind the workshop after dark, at the edge of the marketplace during errand runs, or in half-collapsed buildings where the only witnesses were pigeons and regret. They played quickly, quietly, and always with a lookout posted. If anyone spotted the master approaching, even at a distance where he looked like a moralistic dot on the horizon, the dice disappeared faster than guilt. Even seemingly harmless fun attracted suspicion. Singing too loudly, suspicious. Laughing in the street, suspicious. Talking with unfamiliar young people, extremely suspicious. Apprentices lived under the belief that any form of visible joy might be interpreted as a sign of moral decay, and because Tudor communities were small and tightly woven, news travelled fast. The town baker might mention seeing the apprentice near a group of musicians. The neighbour across the lane might casually note that the apprentice seemed very cheerful today. By dinner, the master would be glaring across the table with the conviction of a man who had just discovered sin lurking in his workshop. Of course, part of this policing was economic. Apprentices couldn't afford taverns, ale, or gambling losses. Their lack of wages made them financially fragile, and a single poor decision could saddle them with debts, obligations, or social entanglements that jeopardized their apprenticeship. Masters were strict partly to protect their investment, but also because they believed wholeheartedly in discipline as a daily nutrient. And yet, despite the restrictions, apprentices found ways to create fun in the cracks between supervision. They made jokes quietly during work. They formed friendships with other apprentices who shared their exhaustion, their frustrations, and their dreams of one day entering a tavern proudly rather than in disguise. They played simple games with stones or sticks when no one watched. On festival days, they enjoyed snippets of joy that were culturally permitted. And on exceptionally rare occasions, when errands took them farther from home, when journeymen were distracted, when the master trusted them a little too much, they might slip into a tavern just long enough to listen to laughter, smell roasted meat, and feel momentarily connected to a world beyond work. They didn't stay long, they didn't drink much, they couldn't afford to, but those brief stolen moments became memories apprentices replayed during long nights and longer workdays, reminders that life contained pleasures, even if they were rationed more strictly than food. The irony, of course, was that apprentices weren't forbidden from fun because fun was dangerous. They were forbidden from fun because unsupervised young people enjoying themselves made every adult nervous. The Tudor worldview saw joy as something earned after years of struggle, not something allowed during it. Apprentices were in training, and training left no room for delight unless the church calendar specifically allowed it. Fun wasn't illegal, it was just suspicious. For a Tudor apprentice, religion wasn't a matter of spiritual exploration or private conviction. It was a scheduled obligation, a compulsory weekly performance of moral correctness. Faith in Tudor England was tightly woven into civic life, legal authority, and household discipline. You didn't choose a church, you didn't choose your level of devotion, you didn't even choose your posture during prayers. Your master chose all of it. Religion was not your personal journey, it was your chore. Sunday was supposed to be a day of rest, but for apprentices, it meant shifting from one form of supervision to another. The church acted as the spiritual extension of the master's authority. Another institution watching you, judging you, and reporting back if your behaviour suggested an inner life not entirely controlled by your household. Attendance wasn't casual, it wasn't optional. It wasn't even about salvation most of the time, it was a public display of obedience. The apprentice's job began long before the service started. First, you had to make yourself presentable, cleaner than usual, or at least washed enough that the congregation didn't assume you lived beneath a cart. This meant splashing water on your face until the dirt surrendered, brushing your garments, smoothing the worst wrinkles, and trying to coax your hair into a shape that suggested you had not been raised entirely by the workshop tools. Masters expected apprentices to reflect the household's respectability. Showing up dirty wasn't simply unattractive, it was an insult to the master's reputation. Then came the walk to the parish church, a journey conducted in total awareness of who might be watching. Neighbours observed apprentices with hawk-like intensity. If you looked bored, you were marked as lacking piety. If you looked too cheerful, you were marked as lacking seriousness. If you walked too quickly or too slowly, someone would inevitably assume you were planning mischief either before or after the sermon. By the time apprentices reached the church doors, many were already exhausted from the mental gymnastics of looking appropriately neutral. Inside the church, apprentices entered a world where stillness was a virtue and movement was a sin. They sat or knelt where instructed, joined prayers when expected, and listened to sermons with the kind of rigid attention normally reserved for avoiding falling objects. Apprentices weren't encouraged to question theology, contemplate spiritual meaning, or feel emotional connection. Their job was to participate correctly, to bow at the right moments, recite the correct lines, and avoid fidgeting no matter how long the sermon stretched. And Tudor sermons stretched. They were not brief pep talks designed to uplift the soul. They were marathon lectures packed with warnings, moral lessons, political messages, reminders of sin, reminders of consequences, and the occasional story meant to scare children into lifelong compliance. Apprentices learned early that looking away, whispering or nodding off could bring unwanted attention. The parish community was quick to notice misbehaviour, and even quicker to report it to a master who regarded church conduct as a measure of personal discipline. The irony was that apprentices didn't need strong religious convictions to participate. The system operated on compliance, not belief. Everyone attended church because everyone was expected to attend, and failing to do so raised suspicions that extended far beyond faith. Skipping church suggested idleness. Idleness suggested moral weakness. Moral weakness suggested potential criminality. In a tightly controlled society where reputation shaped every opportunity, apprentices couldn't afford to appear spiritually unreliable. Church attendance also served as a weekly roll call for the town. By standing in the same place every Sunday, the community could confirm you were alive, present, and behaving. If you missed a service people noticed, they asked questions. The priest might send word, neighbours might whisper, and your master, already balancing the fear of apprentices discovering taverns, would immediately assume the worst. even outside of Sunday, religion shaped apprentice life. Feast days, holy days, and seasonal observances structured the calendar. Some offered moments of relief from work. Others demanded additional chores or public participation. Apprentices sang hymns, joined processions, helped decorate the church, and sometimes assisted with community events tied to religious celebrations. None of this was voluntary. The church wasn't just a spiritual authority, it was a civic one. Your presence signalled your membership in the moral fabric of the town. Religion also reinforced household hierarchy. Masters cast themselves as spiritual guides, responsible for the apprentice's moral condition. If an apprentice misbehaved, the master framed correction not only as discipline, but as saving the apprentice's soul from decline. This gave moral weight to punishment and added spiritual guilt to ordinary mistakes. Apprentices learned that sin was not just a matter of conscience, it was a matter of reputation, stability, and household order. And yet, even with all its rigidity, church could sometimes offer apprentices a rare moment of passive existence. Surrounded by others, seated in a sacred space, free from immediate chores, an apprentice could, if only briefly, rest their thoughts. They couldn't slouch, couldn't doze, and couldn't appear inattentive, but they could exist without being shouted at. The monotony of long sermons gave them time to breathe, however formally. In a life defined by the labour, even solemn stillness was a kind of reprieve. But make no mistake, religion in a Tudor apprentice's world was a system of structure, not choice. It shaped behaviour more than belief, and participation was a duty, not a journey. The church didn't ask whether apprentices believed sincerely. It asked whether they showed up, stood straight, avoided trouble, and reflected well on their households. You didn't believe, you complied. When most people imagine Tudor apprentices, they picture boys hauling timber, pumping bellows, or sweeping workshops in a cloud of sawdust and misery. But girls were apprentices too, quietly, constantly, and with a set of restrictions so specific and suffocating that one wonders how any of them survived the experience with their sanity intact. Female apprentices lived in a world where everything was a rule, everything was a warning, and everything they did was watched twice as closely as any boy performing the same task, with half the scrutiny. Girls typically apprenticed in trades considered appropriate for their gender: textiles, millinery, sewing, dressmaking, household service, midwifery assistance, or roles related to domestic management. These trades were vital. Tudor society would have collapsed without clothing, linens, and organised households, but prestige wasn't the reward. Instead, these trades were treated as natural extensions of what girls were already expected to do for free. Apprenticeship simply formalised the expectation that they would spend their waking hours producing, repairing, and beautifying the world around them without ever becoming too important in it. The first barrier female apprentices faced was mobility. Boys could be sent across towns or even to cities like London to apprentice. Girls, on the other hand, were often kept closer to home, not because their families adored them, but because society trusted boys to wander far more than it trusted girls to cross the street unsupervised. Distance equaled danger. Danger equaled reputation damage. Reputation damage equaled ruined marriage prospects. And no Tudor parent wanted their daughter's future jeopardised, because she spent too much time in a household where someone sneezed improperly. Masters who took in female apprentices also tended to be mistresses, wives or widows running businesses or managing specialised workshops. This wasn't because men couldn't teach girls, but because no one wanted gossip. Gossip in Tudor England was more powerful than plague. A girl living in the household of an unrelated man? Scandalous. A girl working unsupervised near male journeymen? Dangerous. A girl seen outdoors too often? Suspicious. The apprentice might be learning valuable skills, but everyone around her was learning something far wiser: how quickly rumours could form without evidence. Once placed, girls encountered the same pressures as boys, but doubled. They worked long hours, performed repetitive tasks, endured berating supervisors, and lived with the same exhausting schedule that defined apprenticeship. But they also bore the burden of perfect behaviour. A boy who muttered under his breath or scowled during work was reprimanded. A girl who did the same was told she was developing an ill nature, a phrase that carried social consequences far beyond the workshop walls. Boys were expected to become workers. Girls were expected to become workers and pleasant creatures whose personalities did not interfere with anyone else's comfort. Clothing reflected these expectations too. While boys dressed plainly, girls dressed plainly and carefully. Their garments needed to be modest, clean enough to avoid judgment, but sturdy enough to withstand hours of work. Anything too fitted invited comment. Anything too loose suggested sloppiness. Anything torn or shabby reflected poorly on the mistress of the household. Apprentices often spent evenings sewing their own repairs because appearing unkempt was not only embarrassing, it was dangerous to their reputation in ways boys rarely experienced. Female apprentices also lived under stricter household rules. Their curfews were tighter. Their social interactions were monitored. Conversations with young men were treated like potential diplomatic crises requiring intervention. Additional training might include household morals, curtsying, proper speech, modesty lessons, and reminders to avoid forwardness, a Tudor term for any behaviour implying the girl had a personality. Even work within their trades carried gendered expectations. A girl learning sewing, spinning, or millinery was not just learning a skill, she was learning how to be useful without being assertive. She could handle delicate materials, operate expensive tools, and maintain precise standards, but she was not supposed to show ambition. If she demonstrated exceptional talent, the mistress might praise her, but only so long as that talent didn't overshadow the household's hierarchy. Girls who were too skilled risked being labelled prideful. Boys who were too skilled were called promising. And then, layered atop all this, came the persistent assumption that a girl's apprenticeship was just preparation for marriage. Even if she became a talented clothier or a respected seamstress, many believed her craft would ultimately serve her future husband's household more than her own independence. Some female apprentices did go on to run shops, manage businesses and train other girls, but society saw these successes as exceptions, not expectations. Still, for many girls, apprenticeship was the only structured path toward a trade, a wage, or a chance at autonomy. It offered skills valuable enough to support themselves if widowed, unmarried, or simply unwilling to depend on unreliable men. Apprenticeship taught them competence, resilience, and the ability to navigate households that demanded perfection without offering comfort. It gave girls tools, literal and metaphorical, that Tudor society often tried to keep from them. But the challenges remained. Girls could be dismissed more easily than boys for imagined improprieties. Masters and mistresses judged them not only on work quality but on posture, tone, modesty, and the impossible task of behaving properly at all times. A single misinterpreted gesture could spark gossip that followed them for years. Within this environment, apprentices learned quickly that silence was safer than confidence, that diligence mattered more than expression, and that femininity was a performance with no intermission. They did the same work. They earned fewer rights, and they carried more judgment than any human shoulders should bear. For many Tudor apprentices, the location of their apprenticeship shaped their entire experience. A boy or girl apprenticed in a rural village lived one kind of reality, a world of familiar faces, seasonal rhythms, and workshops attached to family homes. But an apprentice sent to a city, especially London, lived in a completely different universe. City apprenticeships carried prestige, strict regulation, and the seductive promise of upward mobility. But the daily reality, noise, filth, constant supervision, guild pressure, and a population density that made personal space feel like a rumour. Rural apprenticeships were more intimate, steady, and community-based. The workshop was usually part of the master's home or located a few steps away. Everyone knew everyone else. Customers visited because they personally knew the craftsman. Children grew up surrounded by the same fields, forests, and neighbours they had always known. For rural apprentices, the world felt contained, knowable, predictable. There were fewer guild officials, fewer civic rules, fewer eyes watching for misbehaviour. A mistake was embarrassing, certainly, but it did not become gossip for an entire district. But urban apprenticeships? Those were another species entirely. London, in particular, was the beating heart of Tudor commerce, boasting thousands of shops, stalls, workshops, and the trades packed into streets so narrow 2 carts couldn't pass without a diplomatic conversation. The noise was constant. Cartwheels clattering, merchants shouting prise, animals bleating, bells ringing, and somewhere in the distance, someone always arguing about something. New apprentices arriving in London often felt overwhelmed before they even unpacked their single spare shirt. Urban apprentices lived under the authority of the city's mighty guilds, the craft organisations that controlled training standards, membership requirements, business practices, professional conduct, and almost every detail of a craftsman's life. These guilds weren't gentle guiding institutions. They were bureaucratic powerhouses with strict rules and officials who enforced them with the enthusiasm of people who truly loved paperwork. Rural masters answered mostly to themselves and local custom. Urban masters answered to guilds. And urban apprentices answered to everyone. City apprenticeships followed strict regulations. Contracts had to be formally registered. Training had to meet guild standards. And apprentices could not simply drift off into questionable neighbourhoods or run side errands without permission. The guilds wanted apprentices to become reliable future members, not street troublemakers. And the city authorities wanted apprentices to stay out of taverns, gambling dens, brothels, and riotous gatherings, activities London seemed to produce in bulk. Because London apprenticeships were prestigious, they attracted ambitious families hoping to secure a promising future for their children. Many apprentices in London came from small towns or rural villages, sent away to work for masters whose reputations could open doors. But arriving in the city also meant adapting quickly to an environment bursting with temptation and punishment. Apprentices in London lived in crowded, multi-storey houses, sometimes with a dozen people sharing cramped quarters. The air inside workshops thickened with dust, smoke, heat, and the smell of materials being shaped, dyed, hammered, or boiled. The streets outside were no better, muddy in winter, dusty in summer, full of refuse, and populated by vendors, beggars pretending to be sailors, and the occasional pig wandering freely as if it owned the place. Urban apprentices were constantly moving. They ran errands across neighbourhoods, carried goods between markets, delivered finished work to customers, and fetched supplies from docks or warehouses. Each errand required navigating crowds, avoiding thieves, and remembering that losing anything, coins, tools, materials, meant facing the master with an expression of dread usually reserved for natural disasters. Rural apprentices might know every face in town. Urban apprentices encountered strangers at every turn, and strangers had opinions. Apprentices were often mocked by older workers, tempted by street gamblers, tripped by mischievous children, or lured by performers who created pockets of joy in the otherwise harsh cityscape. It was a daily test. Obey the master's strict behavioural rules while living in an environment that offered endless opportunities to break them. City apprentices also dealt with the famous London curfew bell. When the bell rang at night, apprentices were expected to be indoors, not roaming the streets. Any apprentice caught out after curfew risked fines, public punishment, or being marched home by the night watch, an escort no apprentice wished to experience, as they reported everything they saw to masters eager to demonstrate moral leadership. And yet, for all its pressures, London offered opportunities rural areas could not. Apprentices who completed training in the city often had better prospects, access to guild membership, higher wages as journeymen, connections to wealthy customers, or the chance to open their own workshops in bustling markets. Some apprentices even married into merchant families or inherited businesses from childless masters, rare outcomes that rural apprentices could only dream of. The city also exposed apprentices to a diversity of skills, ideas, and people. They met immigrants, sailors, traders, and craftsmen from across Europe. They saw goods and materials unavailable in the countryside, They overheard political debates, religious arguments, and scandalous gossip. The city broadened their world, even if it also overwhelmed it. Thus, the urban apprentice lived a life balanced between opportunity and constraint. London promised success, but delivered noise, competition, rules, and the constant awareness that one misstep could derail a future more quickly than a journeyman flinging a tool across the workshop. The city promised opportunity. It delivered crowds and rules. For a Tudor apprentice, the idea of running away sometimes flickered through the mind the way a candle guttered in a draught. Brief, tempting, and doomed. Apprenticeship was exhausting, restrictive, and often miserable enough to inspire dreams of escape. But in Tudor England, fleeing your master wasn't seen as a personal crisis or an emotional breaking point. It wasn't interpreted as someone overwhelmed, mistreated, or desperate for autonomy. No, running away was classified as something far simpler and far less sympathetic. A crime. To understand why, you must remember that an apprentice wasn't just a trainee. They were an investment. The master provided food, lodging, clothing, supervision, and years of training. In return, he expected labour, obedience, and the payoff of a skilled worker emerging after years of effort. If an apprentice ran away, the master lost both his investment and his reputation. In a society built on contracts and rigid roles, failure to control an apprentice reflected poorly on the entire household. So the law stepped in, not to protect apprentices, but to protect the system. Running away or absconding triggered an almost bureaucratic chain reaction. First, the master filed a complaint. This complaint did not read, "My apprentice is emotionally distressed." It read, "My property and training has gone missing." The authorities, local constables, guild officials, or city watchmen, treated the apprentice like a fugitive, not a troubled youth. Notices might be circulated. Town criers might announce descriptions. In larger cities, guild networks spread the word with efficiency that would make modern administrators proud. The legal reasoning was simple. The indenture contract had the force of law. Breaking it was not an act of defiance. It was a violation akin to theft. The apprentice was, in essence, stealing themselves from the master's rightful control. And because apprentices were minors with limited legal standing, the courts always leaned toward the master's side. The apprentice's personal suffering? Irrelevant. The disruption to the master's business? Crucial. Punishment began the moment the runaway was captured, which happened more often than apprentices like to imagine. Travel wasn't easy. Roads were watched. Inns asked questions. Strangers noticed young people walking alone with no money and no explanation. And apprentices, having lived under supervision their entire lives, were rarely experts in stealth. Many were caught within days, sometimes hours, of their attempted escape. And when they were brought back, that was where the real consequences began. First came public humiliation. A master might march the apprentice through the streets as demonstration of authority restored. Neighbours judged. Fellow apprentices whispered. Journeymen smirked with the schadenfreude of men who remembered contemplating escape but never acting on it. Being dragged back wasn't just physically punishing, it was socially devastating. Then came legal penalties. Courts could order the apprentice to finish the remainder of their term, plus additional years as punishment. Imagine surviving 6 grueling years only to be informed you now owed 2 more because you dared to imagine a life where you could make decisions. Other punishments included fines, which the apprentice had no means to pay, or temporary confinement. In some areas, runaways were jailed briefly as a warning to others. Masters too had discretion in their responses. Some chose harsher discipline within the household, doubling workloads or enforcing stricter behaviour rules. Others limited the apprentice's movements even more severely. Running away didn't earn sympathy, it earned restrictions. The apprentice returned not to the life they had known, but to one monitored more closely, trusted less, and peppered with reminders of their ingratitude. But the harshest consequence wasn't physical at all. It was economic ruin. A runaway apprentice lost the master's goodwill. They lost training time. They tarnished their reputation in a society where reputation shaped every possibility. Even if they completed their apprenticeship later, guild members and craftsmen might remember them as unreliable. Future employment could be jeopardized. Word travelled fast in Tudor communities, and no one wanted to hire a journeyman known for attempted escape. For girls, the consequences were even worse. A runaway female apprentice caused instant scandal. The assumption was that she had fallen into immorality, regardless of the truth. Her reputation could be permanently destroyed, and she risked being barred from completing her apprenticeship at all. Female runaways were often treated not as defiant workers, but as endangered morals in need of containment. In many cases, they were returned directly to family custody, where they faced a different set of punishments entirely. And yet, apprentices still tried to run. They tried when the labour broke them. They tried when the yelling hollowed them. They tried when the sleeping conditions wore them down, when the food wasn't enough, when the master's temper became unbearable, when home felt impossibly far away. Some apprentices simply wanted a different apprenticeship, hoping another trade or another master might suit them better. Others wanted to return home. Others wished to disappear into cities where anonymity offered a fragile chance at freedom, working illegally for other craftsmen willing to ignore guild law. But this too was dangerous. Guilds aggressively pursued illegal labour, and runaway apprentices risked new punishment if discovered working outside the apprenticeship system. Only a tiny number succeeded long-term, vanishing into larger cities or moving far enough away that their identities evaporated. These rare escapes built quiet new lives outside the rules, lives that left no official record because official records would have sent pursuers knocking at the door. For the vast majority, however, escape only delayed the inevitable, a return to the master, a harsher apprenticeship, and the realization that freedom in Tudor society was not a choice but a privilege granted only after completing your required suffering. Running away wasn't freedom, it was paperwork and punishment. In the world of Tudor apprenticeships, injuries weren't alarming, they were inevitable. They came with the job the same way splinters come with woodwork or smoke comes with fire. Every workshop, from the bustling city forge to the quiet village tailor's loft, held dangers that most modern workers would flee from in seconds. Tools were sharp, fires were hot, materials were heavy, floors were uneven, lighting was dim, and absolutely nothing resembled a safety regulation. To be a Tudor apprentice was to live in a perpetual obstacle course designed by someone who believed suffering built character. The workshops themselves were accidents waiting to happen. For apprentices working with metal, the forge glowed day and night, a blazing mouth ready to scorch any hand placed too near. Sparks flew like malicious fireflies. Hammers rang against anvils, tongs slipped, metal cracked unexpectedly, and apprentices, usually stationed too close for comfort, spent their days dodging dangers while attempting not to look like they were dodging dangers. Fear was considered unprofessional. Carpenters' workshops weren't any kinder. Saws had teeth ready to bite the inattentive. Chisels rolled off benches. Wood splintered along unpredictable grains. Heavy beams fell if balanced with anything less than divine precision. One moment of distraction could turn a simple cut into a lifelong reminder that wood did not care about your fingers. Textile apprentices suffered hazards of a different kind. Spinning wheels caught loose sleeves. Dyes boiled and splattered. Needles stabbed hands with the enthusiasm of tiny, relentless assassins. Even iron tools used to smooth fabric became burning hot without warning. Cloth looked innocent, but the work behind it left hands blistered, pricked, and permanently calloused. Bakers burned themselves. Tanners inhaled fumes that could make grown adults question their life choices. Masons dropped stones on their feet. Coopers smashed fingers between staves. Every trade carried its own brand of injury, and apprentices, because they were inexperienced and tasked with the least forgiving chores, collected wounds the way some people collect souvenirs. Except nobody wanted these souvenirs. And when injuries happened, treatment was simple. Do something quick, do something cheap, and get back to work. A burn from the forge? plunge it into cold water, wrap it in a rag, and return to pumping the bellows. A deep cut from a chisel, bind it tightly, hope it stops bleeding and continue shaping wood. A twisted ankle after tripping over tools in poor lighting. Apply a poultice, grit your teeth, and try not to limp too obviously in front of the master. There was no take the day off. There was no report this to management. There was definitely no the workplace will adjust to protect you. Apprenticeship assumed and demanded that the work continued. The master wasn't cruel, well, not always. He simply lived in a society that viewed injuries as part of the learning process. You cut yourself, you'd be more careful next time. You burned your hand, you'd respect the forge. You bruised your shin, watch where you're going. The lesson was absorbed through the bandages, and if you thought something was dangerous, well, that was just proof you hadn't toughened up yet. Serious injuries did happen, and they were terrifying. A badly infected wound could end an apprenticeship and a life. Broken bones were set poorly, burns scarred permanently. Some apprentices lost fingers or hands, rendering them unable to complete their trade. In such cases, masters might release the apprentice from the contract, not out of compassion, but because a worker who could not work was an economic burden. What became of the injured apprentice then? Often nothing good. Disability support systems did not exist. Families took them back when possible. Otherwise, the apprentice had to navigate a world with limited options and even less sympathy. But most injuries were minor, meaning survivable, tolerable, ignorable. Apprentices developed astonishing levels of pain endurance. They worked through throbbing joints, cracked skin, raw knuckles, and headaches from fumes or dust. Pain became a background noise. Complaining was discouraged, unless you wanted to earn a lecture on discipline or a reminder that the master himself had worked through worse during his own youth. Journeymen sometimes offered pointers on avoiding accidents, but usually only after they watched you hurt yourself. Advice came in the form of casual warnings delivered moments too late, like, "That pan's hot," as you already burned your hand, or "That saw bites," as you examined a fresh cut on your thumb. Their amusement was often part of the lesson. Apprentices who survived the early months of their training wore their scars like a badge of inevitability. Even the environment fought against them. Workshops were dimly lit by windows or candles, creating shadows where hazards hid. Floors were slick with spilled materials or uneven from years of use. Tools were stored wherever there was space, including places no rational person would expect them. Fire crackled in one corner. Sharp tools glinted in another. The entire workspace was a labyrinth of things waiting to injure someone who was tired, rushed, or unlucky. And apprentices were always tired, always rushed, always unlucky. Yet, for all the danger, the system kept running. The injured apprentice would finish the day. The master would accept this as normal. The household would move on. Pain was temporary. Apprenticeship was permanent. And the only real requirement was endurance. The good news, you survived. The bad news, you're still working tomorrow. If coins were hard to earn and harder to keep, reputation was the only currency an apprentice possessed, and it could evaporate faster than ale on a hot tavern floor. In Tudor England, character wasn't a private matter. It was a public commodity, scrutinised, measured, whispered about, and traded in conversations across workshops, marketplaces, and churchyards. And for apprentices, who had no wealth, no rank, and no independent standing, their reputation was the fragile thread upon which every future opportunity depended. 7 years of training could be undone by one rumour, one careless comment, one accusation, one moment of being seen where you shouldn't be, or speaking to someone you shouldn't speak to, or appearing too cheerful for someone in your social position. It was brutally simple. An apprentice's worth wasn't only in what they could do with their hands, but in how convincingly they performed respectability under constant community surveillance. Masters understood the stakes. They weren't just training labour, they were shaping future guild members, craftspeople, business owners, and representatives of their trade. So they guarded their apprentices' behaviour as fiercely as they guarded their tools. Any hint that an apprentice lacked discipline or moral fibre reflected directly on the master. And if the apprentice earned a reputation for misbehaviour, the master risked embarrassment. And embarrassment was a social wound Tudor adults took personally. Reputation began forming the moment an apprentice entered a household. Neighbours noted the child's manners. Journeymen speculated about their potential. The local priest assessed their piety. Merchants judged their attitude during errands. Every interaction was an audition. A polite greeting strengthened your standing. A clumsy stumble while carrying goods became a story retold 3 times before lunch. A single rude remark could travel across town faster than the plague fleas Tudor people feared. And because apprentices were so young, people expected them to fail, yet punished them socially when they did. Their behaviour needed to be spotless, not excellent, not impressive, just spotless, which ironically was nearly impossible in a world where their clothing was worn and their hands were stained from work, and their exhaustion made perfect politeness a distant fantasy. The rules of reputation were unwritten but universally understood. Don't loiter. Loitering meant idleness. Idleness meant moral decay. Don't speak too loudly. Loudness meant disrespect. Don't get too quiet. Quietness meant you were hiding something. Don't talk to questionable individuals. Questionable individuals included anyone your master didn't like. Don't contradict adults. Even if they were undeniably wrong, don't appear overly confident. Confidence suggested arrogance, and arrogance suggested future rebellion. Don't appear too timid. Timidity suggested weakness and unreliability. Navigating these contradictions was an art form, and apprentices learned it the way they learned everything else, through repeated humiliation until the lesson sank in. Reputation mattered during apprenticeship, but it mattered even more afterward. Once training ended, the apprentice became a journeyman, a free worker expected to travel, find employment, and eventually secure the funds or sponsorship to set up a workshop. But no master would hire a journeyman with a history of misbehaviour. No guild would welcome someone with a record of unreliability. No community would trust a tradesman whose apprenticeship ended in scandal. A master's recommendation, therefore, was priceless. It was the apprentice's passport into adulthood. It declared not only that they had learned the craft, but that they were sufficiently dependable, respectful, honest, sober, God-fearing, hard-working, and perhaps most importantly, boringly well-behaved. If the master refused to give such a recommendation, career over. A perfectly skilled apprentice could be barred from employment simply because they had once been caught gambling, sneaking into a tavern, speaking too boldly, or quarrelling with neighbours. And because gossip spread so easily, even exaggerated or false rumours could stain an apprentice's prospects permanently. Reputation was not a stable currency. It fluctuated wildly depending on the storytelling habits of the town. This pressure created a strange duality within apprentices. Outwardly, they performed virtue. They spoke meekly. They obeyed rules. They appeared pious, quiet, diligent, and trustworthy. Inwardly, they carried all the frustration, exhaustion, and resentment that came with having every aspect of their behaviour monitored by both employer and entire community. Female apprentices faced even harsher stakes. Where male apprentices might suffer lost credibility, female apprentices risked moral condemnation, or even marriage prospects being destroyed if gossip painted them as immodest, outspoken, or suspiciously friendly. A boy's reputation affected his career. A girl's reputation affected her entire life. Ironically, reputation became both a burden and a silent source of strength. Apprentices who managed to maintain a spotless record gained influence long before they held any formal power. A well-behaved apprentice earned trust. Trust allowed responsibility. Responsibility led to opportunities. Opportunities led to advancement. Reputation was the ladder they climbed in a world where ladders were scarce. By the time an apprentice completed their term, they carried not only the skills of their trade, but the weight of years spent performing moral reliability. They emerged shaped not only by disciplines of craft and labour, but by the knowledge that a single misstep, One whisper, one rumour, one unlucky moment could have shattered everything. One bad rumour could end 7 years of effort, and that fear, more than any punishment, kept apprentices obedient. Finishing a Tudor apprenticeship was supposed to feel like stepping into the sunlight after 7 years in a very disciplined tunnel. The contract ended, the obligations ended, the constant surveillance ended, the master could no longer bark orders at you, confiscate your free time, or lecture you for breathing too confidently near the workshop entrance. For the first time since childhood, you were legally your own person. But freedom in Tudor society came with a catch. You now had to survive without the structure that kept you alive. Apprenticeship was strict, exhausting, and often miserable, but it provided guaranteed food, lodging, and work. The moment you became a journeyman, all of that evaporated. You were free, yes, but you were also unemployed, unhoused, and entirely responsible for navigating an adult world that did not pause to welcome your trembling optimism. The first shock new journeymen experienced was the absolute lack of stability. During apprenticeship, everything was controlled. Your meals, your chores, your waking hours, your sleeping hours, even the amount of joy you were legally allowed to express. But as a journeyman, every stability disappeared overnight. You needed to find a place to sleep, find a workshop willing to hire you, and find a way to afford those things while still possessing the income of someone who had never been paid before. Journeymen typically travelled in search of work. The very word journeyman comes from the French journée, meaning day's work, a reminder that pay was no longer guaranteed but earned day by day. You went where the employment was, a nearby town, a distant city, or a bustling commercial centre, where demand for skilled hands was higher. If you came from a rural apprenticeship, the journey might take you far from home. If you trained in London, you might now be pushed into smaller towns, hoping the competition wasn't nearly as sharp as the tools everyone else carried. But finding work wasn't as simple as showing up with tools and enthusiasm. Journeymen entered a market already saturated with other newly freed apprentices, many of them older, more experienced, or better connected. Workshops hired only when busy, and masters often preferred workers they already knew, or those recommended by trusted guild members. A journeyman with a lukewarm reference from his master, or worse, one with a reputation tinged by rumour, found doors closing quickly. Housing was another ordeal. Journeymen typically lived in communal lodging houses, crowded, noisy, and filled with dozens of men whose combined smells could have peeled paint from walls if Tudor walls had paint. Beds were rented, space was tight, and conditions were unpredictable. Some journeymen slept above the workshops where they were temporarily employed. Others slept where they could, in inns if they could afford it, in barns if they could not, and occasionally outdoors when luck ran thinner than their bedrolls. Food was no longer included either. The journeyman had to budget every coin earned, balancing meals against housing, tools, clothing repairs, and the slow, steady savings required to eventually establish his own workshop. Apprenticeship had been meagre, but at least it had been predictable. Journeymen learned quickly that adulthood came with an impressive new array of ways to starve. Guilds played a significant role in this new stage of life. With apprenticeship complete, the journeyman was eligible, eventually, to become a full guild member. But eligibility did not mean acceptance. Gaining membership required money, connections, proof of skill, and sometimes the creation of a masterpiece, a test object demonstrating exceptional craftsmanship. Producing this masterpiece required expensive materials, which the journeyman had to purchase on his own. Passing the test depended on the guild's standards, and sometimes on the politics within the guild hall. Many journeymen never advanced beyond this stage. They remained permanent employees, moving between workshops whenever work allowed. Others travelled widely, earning money in short bursts, gaining experience, and building a network of contacts that might one day sponsor their guild admission. Journeyman life could be exciting in theory, new places, new people, new possibilities, but in reality, it often meant precarious employment and the constant fear of economic collapse. Social life changed too. As an apprentice, your world was small and dictated by the master. As a journeyman, you could finally drink ale in taverns without risking immediate punishment. You could gamble openly, mingle freely, and court women without the household scolding you for moral failures. This new freedom, however, came with the risk of spending hard-earned wages too quickly. Many journeymen gained reputations for rowdy gatherings, late-night celebrations, and questionable decisions that made their carefully earned money vanish before rent was paid. Female apprentices who became journeymen, journeywomen, faced even greater instability. Some found employment as assistants in dressmaking shops or garment workshops. Others worked as household servants for wages. Few could travel freely, and even fewer could gain guild membership. Their freedom was narrow, and their options limited. Still, for those who managed to secure stable work, the journeyman stage offered more independence than they had ever tasted. Yet despite the hardships, becoming a journeyman was still a triumph. It meant you had survived. You had endured the training, the discipline, the injuries, the hunger, the hierarchy, and the endless demands of apprenticeship. You had emerged with real skills. Skills valuable enough to support you if you worked hard enough and avoided disaster. Journeyman life was unstable, but it was also the first time in years that your future was not already decided for you. You were free, but freedom came with rent due, and hunger, and competition, and a toolbox full of responsibilities no one had warned you about. Congratulations, you're free. Now find work. Behind the idolized image of Tudor apprentices rising through hard work and discipline lurked a darker truth. Many never finished their term at all. Apprenticeship was designed as a gateway to stability, but it frequently functioned as a sieve. Children entered the system with hope. The system answered with relentless demands, harsh environments, and risks that could, and often did, remove them permanently from the path their families envisioned. When a Tudor apprentice disappeared from the roster, it wasn't always because of misconduct. Sometimes, life itself simply didn't let them stay. The most common obstacle was illness, a near-constant presence in Tudor life. Disease swept through communities with cold efficiency. Apprentices lived in cramped quarters, worked long hours, slept poorly, ate irregular diets, and existed under near-perpetual physical strain, conditions that eroded immune systems faster than masters eroded patience. A common cold could escalate into something dangerous. A fever could become a death sentence. A minor infection could turn into a fatal wound. Apprentices lacked time to rest, lacked control over their environments, and lacked access to medical care beyond herbal remedies, guesswork, and desperate prayers. Workshops themselves were biological hazards. Bakers inhaled flour dust. Metal workers breathed smoke. Tanners worked among fumes that made even the rats hesitate. Tailoring apprentices spent hours in close spaces thick with fibres. And absolutely everyone inhaled the daily stew of street smells, human smells, and workshop smells that defined Tudor air quality. Illness didn't simply visit, it lived with you. The next barrier was injury, which didn't always stop at bruises. While most apprentices endured cuts, blisters, and burns as a normal part of the job, serious accidents claimed their share of training lives. A fall from a ladder, a heavy beam dropped at the wrong angle, a tool mishandled, a fire that grew faster than expected. In professions involving heat, metal, livestock, or sharp tools, fatal accidents were not anomalies, they were occupational realities. Even when injuries weren't fatal, they could end an apprenticeship. A boy who lost the use of his hand could not become a carpenter. A girl who permanently damaged her eyesight couldn't become a seamstress. The master, bound by practical necessity rather than compassion, would dismiss the apprentice and void the contract. The child then returned home not only injured but stripped of the one path that might have led toward financial independence. For poorer families, this could be devastating. Beyond illness and physical danger, many apprentices simply didn't survive the abuse embedded in the system. While not every master was cruel, enough were harsh, volatile, or neglectful to create an environment where despair was a frequent companion. Emotional abuse wore down the spirit, physical abuse wore down the body. Some apprentices ran away not because of rebellion, but because staying meant suffering with no escape. But running away, as earlier chapters revealed, rarely ended well. Those who weren't dragged back sometimes vanished into dangerous urban underworlds or fell victim to crime and starvation or exploitation. Their failure wasn't moral, it was survival. And then there were apprentices whose families removed them from their positions. Not out of concern for their happiness. Tudor families rarely centred childhood emotions, but because the master failed to provide adequate food, clothing or training. An apprentice who wasn't being taught the trade properly was wasting years of potential future wages, and every year mattered in a world where adulthood offered few safety nets. Sometimes families withdrew an apprentice if the household conditions became visibly abusive, though such decisions risked conflict with guilds or community leaders. Removing a child was not simple, but it was sometimes necessary to keep that child alive. Death haunted Tudor children in general. Apprenticeship didn't change that. If anything, it increased the odds. Epidemics swept through cities, wiping out entire households. Famine struck rural areas, weakening apprentices along with everyone else. Outbreaks of sweating sickness, plague, and smallpox didn't discriminate between experienced craftsmen and their young trainees. Some masters buried more than one apprentice over the course of their careers, grimly accustomed to the losses. It is easy to imagine apprenticeship as a reliable ladder, harsh but still steady. The truth was far more precarious. Records show astonishing numbers of apprenticeships ending prematurely, whether by abandonment, dismissal, illness, or mortality. A successful completed apprenticeship was a triumph, not a guarantee. For every child who reached the journeyman stage, another faded from the rolls unnoticed, except by their grieving families, or the master who filed the voided contract. Yet despite the grim statistics, apprenticeship remained the most viable path for countless Tudor children. It offered structure, training, community recognition, and the possibility, fragile though it was, of social mobility. Parents knew the risks. Masters knew the risks. Apprentices themselves learned quickly that survival was not automatic, but they walked the path anyway, because the alternative was stagnation, poverty, or uncertainty even greater than the dangers apprenticeship carried. Not everyone made it to graduation. Some didn't make it to adulthood. From a modern viewpoint, handing your child over to a stranger for 7 years of grueling work, discipline and risk sounds unthinkable, practically medieval, which of course it was. Tudor apprenticeship appears harsh, unforgiving and perilously close to institutionalized suffering. So why did parents choose it? Why did they willingly sign contracts that allowed a master to control their child's labor, behavior, future, and at times, even their punishment? The answer was simple, bleak, and deeply human: poverty and hope. For Tudor families, apprenticeship wasn't cruelty. It was strategy. It was survival disguised as opportunity. Most families lived on the economic edge. They farmed small plots, laboured for others, or scraped by on irregular wages. A child's future wasn't a matter of dreams, it was a calculation. If a child stayed home, they became another mouth to feed and another body competing for scarce resources. If they became an apprentice, they transformed from economic liability to future earner. The contract promised food, lodging, clothing, discipline, and, crucially, training. However thin that promise might become in practice, parents clung to it because the alternative was watching their child drift into the same poverty that had defined generations. Apprenticeship offered a path upward. Not for nobility, not for glory, but for stability. A fully trained tradesman could support a household, join a guild, marry, raise children and own property. A girl trained as a seamstress or milliner, though constrained by gendered limitations, could still create steady income or secure better marriage prospects. For parents trapped in agricultural or labouring work, this new trajectory mattered more than anything. It meant their child might escape the grind that had swallowed their own lives. Families who weren't poor still valued apprenticeship. Even respectable middling households understood that a child needed a craft, a trade, or a marketable skill. Officers, clerks, merchants, everyone recognized that adulthood demanded economic function. A child who learned nothing became an adult who earned nothing. Apprenticeship created purpose and discipline. It built a future. Some parents also chose apprenticeship because they recognized their own limitations. A child who stayed home learned only what the family knew. A child sent away could learn a specialized craft that generated income year-round rather than seasonally. In a world where winter threatened starvation and spring offered no guarantees, mastering a trade meant survival during lean months. Parents who loved their children understood that the trade had more to give than they ever could. Harshness was acknowledged, but normalized. Tudor childhood was not wrapped in softness. Children worked from the moment they could carry a bucket, chase geese, spin wool, or haul vegetables. Physical punishment was considered ordinary correction. Hunger wasn't a tragedy, it was a season. Illness was expected. Death was familiar. In this context, the discipline of apprenticeship didn't seem unusual. It seemed structured, predictable, and overseen by someone with professional knowledge. Parents believed, sometimes naively, sometimes rightly, that a master's household offered more order, stability, and training than their own could. There was also the cultural weight of apprenticeship itself. It wasn't merely a job training system, it was a respected institution. Towns celebrated masters who trained numerous apprentices. Guilds protected the status of craftsmen. A child put to a trade earned social recognition, and families felt pride when neighbours learnt their child would become a cooper, a goldsmith, a tailor, or a carpenter. It elevated the family's identity within the community. Instead of being seen as labourers, they became the parents of someone with a future. That mattered. In some cases, families chose apprenticeship because their child showed interest or aptitude. A boy fascinated by metalwork might thrive in a smithy. A girl skilled with needle and thread could excel in a seamstress's shop. But even then, aptitude alone wasn't enough. Parents had to weigh the risks and hope that talent combined with endurance would carry their child through 7 demanding years. And sometimes, though rarely discussed, parents surrendered their children to apprenticeship because they had no choice. A family struck by famine might send a child away so at least one member would be guaranteed meals. A widowed mother unable to feed multiple children might choose to apprentice the eldest to spare the younger ones from starvation. A father burdened by debt might negotiate an apprenticeship to remove one dependent from the household ledger. These choices weren't expressions of neglect. They were acts of survival carried out by people with too few options. Even the darkest realities of apprenticeship, abuse, exhaustion, danger, were often invisible to parents. Children rarely returned home with the full truth. Letters, if they existed at all, were censored by social expectation. Masters rarely admitted harsh treatment, and apprentices learned quickly that complaining carried consequences. Parents might have suspected difficulties, but difficulty was normal. Hardship was normal. The world itself was hard, so they assumed apprenticeship was simply another form of life's unavoidable severity. But hope remained at the centre of every decision. Hope that the child would rise, hope that they would learn, hope that they would survive long enough for it to matter. Hope that a craft could break the cycle of poverty that pinned so many families to the bottom of the social ladder. It wasn't cruel, it was desperate. And desperate choices, in the Tudor world, were often the only choices available. Looking back on the Tudor apprenticeship system after 23 chapters of exhaustion, danger, discipline, and questionable sleeping arrangements, one might be tempted to call it a societal endurance test rather than a childhood. And in a way it was. Apprenticeship wasn't merely job training, it was a survival system, engineered to produce skilled workers, obedient citizens, and well-behaved adults in a world that left little room for softness. It forged discipline, guaranteed labour, and shaped the economic backbone of Tudor England. But it did so at a cost paid by the smallest shoulders in the household. The good news, you learned a trade. The bad news, childhood was the price. Apprenticeship succeeded because it demanded everything. time, energy, loyalty, and the reckless optimism of youth. A master didn't just teach a craft. He reshaped a child into a miniature version of himself, instilling habits that would last a lifetime. Crafts in the Tudor world were not hobbies or creative outlets, they were identities. They determined social status, economic security, and family legacy. To learn a trade was to acquire a future, something most children could not gain any other way. Yet learning that trade meant surrendering the normal freedoms of childhood. There were no lazy afternoons, no aimless play, no gentle schooling. Apprenticeship began as a legal contract and unfolded as a 7-year initiation into adulthood delivered through hard labour. Everything, the early mornings, the scoldings, the hunger, the punishments, the cramped sleep, the feared mistakes, served a purpose. To carve the apprentice into someone capable of surviving a world that would not coddle them later. When apprentices finally emerged as journeymen or journeywomen, they entered adulthood with a set of skills few could dispute. They knew how to work, how to obey, how to endure, and how to navigate the social hierarchies that shape their world. They understood the value of a good master and the danger of a bad one. They had lived the consequences of mistakes and learned the rewards of competence. And after years spent absorbing every lesson, voluntarily or otherwise, they carried their trade into the wider world as their shield against poverty. In this sense, apprenticeship was profoundly effective. It ensured trades did not vanish. It maintained standards. It bound generations together through craft knowledge. A blacksmith's skill survived because apprentices endured sparks and burns to master it. A tailor's precision passed on because a child learned to stitch with aching fingers until stitches finally aligned. Guilds kept the structure alive, masters kept the discipline alive, and apprentices, through resilience or sheer stubbornness, kept the workforce alive. But for all its structure, the system was built on unequal foundations. Apprenticeship granted opportunity, yet it demanded vulnerability. The apprentice entered with nothing, not even autonomy, and the master held complete control. Some masters nurtured, teaching with patience, offering guidance and treating their apprentices as future colleagues. Others used the system to justify cruelty, believing discipline required frequent demonstration. The quality of a child's apprenticeship depended largely on luck, chance of household, chance of personality match, chance of humane treatment. And so the legacy of apprenticeship is a tangled one. For some it was a ladder out of poverty. For others it was a trap. For many it was both, a path that lifted them towards stability while extracting every ounce of childhood softness. Those who survived the 7-year trial emerged as adults, forged by the hardship, trained by necessity, and ultimately prepared for a world that demanded the same endurance their apprenticeship had already perfected. Families saw apprenticeship as hope. Masters saw it as investment. Guilds saw it as protection. Society saw it as order. Only the apprentices saw the full picture. The exhaustion, the fear of punishment, the homesickness, the triumph of mastering a skill, the pride of finishing a task correctly, and the long-awaited moment when freedom finally arrived, even if that freedom came with rent, hunger, and uncertainty. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of Tudor apprenticeship is the way it shaped identity. A completed apprenticeship was not merely a certificate, it was a badge of survival, a symbol that you had endured work meant for adults, discipline meant for soldiers, and responsibility meant for heads of household. For the rest of your life, people knew you were someone who had been tested and had come out the other side with both skill and scars to show for it. It is easy, centuries later, to critique the harshness of the system. Yet within the Tudor world, apprenticeship represented possibility. It carved out a future where few futures existed. It created a workforce resilient enough to build, craft, trade, and innovate in ways crucial to a society on the cusp of modernization. It offered stability in an era of disease, famine, and social upheaval. And though it cost childhood, it offered adulthood in return. So after 7 years of labour, discipline, punishment, learning, Mistakes, scars, hunger, and growth. The Tudor apprentice finally stepped into the world not as a child anymore, but as someone who had earned their place.